In the misty forests of ancient Europe, where amber rivers carved paths through endless woodlands, 1,000 tribes spoke in tongues that would one day echo through the halls of emperors. Here, beneath canopies of oak and ash, the seeds of empire lay dormant in the soil of fragmented kingdoms. The wind carried whispers of destiny across the Rhine, where Roman legions once trembled before painted warriors, and where medieval knights would later ride beneath banners not yet imagined. This is the story of scattered peoples who dreamed of unity, of princes who reached for crowns, and of a land that would rise from the ashes of division to shake the foundations of Europe itself. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. Long before the name Germany graced any map, the vast forests and plains of Central Europe pulsed with the life of countless tribes. The Alemanni, the Franks, the Saxons, the Bavarians. Each group carried within their bloodlines the essence of what would one day become the German people. These were not mere barbarians, as Roman historians would have posterity believe, but sophisticated societies with their own laws, customs, and dreams of greatness. The Rhine River served as more than a boundary. It was a threshold between worlds. On its eastern banks, the Germanic tribes developed their unique culture, far removed from the structured civilization of Rome. They worshipped gods of thunder and war, gathered in sacred groves where ancient oaks stood as pillars between earth and sky, and forged weapons that would become legendary for their strength and beauty. Their society was built on bonds of loyalty that transcended mere kinship. Warriors pledged themselves to chieftains, and chieftains to kings, creating webs of allegiance that stretched across the misty landscapes of their homeland. In the 1st century after Christ, when Roman legions still believed they could conquer all of Europe, a young Germanic chieftain named Arminius changed the course of history. He had been educated in Rome, spoke Latin as fluently as his native tongue, and understood the Roman way of war. Yet when the moment came to choose between his adopted civilization and his people, Arminius chose blood over education, freedom over security. In the dense forests of the Teutoburg, he orchestrated one of Rome's most devastating defeats, destroying 3 entire legions and their commander, Varus. The victory at Teutoburg Forest echoed through the centuries that followed. It proved that the Germanic tribes, when united, could stand against any force. But unity was the challenge. These proud peoples were as quick to fight among themselves as they were to resist foreign invaders. Each tribe jealously guarded its traditions, its territory, its independence. The Saxons in the north developed into fierce seafaring warriors, while the Alemanni in the southwest became master craftsmen and traders. The Franks, perhaps most ambitious of all, began to expand their influence beyond their traditional borders, intermarrying with Roman families and adopting elements of Roman administration. As the Roman Empire gradually weakened, the Germanic tribes found themselves inheriting a world they had once sought to destroy. The Visigoths carved out kingdoms in Spain, the Vandals claimed North Africa, and the Ostrogoths settled in Italy. But it was the Franks who would prove most significant to the future of Germany. Under their king Clovis, they not only conquered vast territories, but also embraced Christianity, creating a bridge between the old pagan world and the new Christian order that was emerging across Europe. The conversion to Christianity marked a turning point in Germanic culture. The old gods, Woden, Dona, Freya, did not vanish overnight, but gradually their worship merged with Christian practices, creating a unique spiritual landscape. Churches rose where sacred groves once stood, but the Germanic love of nature and respect for the natural world infused their Christianity with a character distinctly their own. Monasteries became centres of learning where scribes preserved not only Latin texts, but also the oral traditions of their ancestors, ensuring that the stories of heroes and kings would survive the march of time. The most significant of these Frankish rulers was Charles, known to history as Charlemagne. Born in 747, he inherited a kingdom that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, but his ambitions reached far beyond mere inheritance. Charlemagne envisioned a Christian empire that would unite all the Germanic peoples under one crown, one faith, and one law. His campaigns against the Saxons in the north were brutal and prolonged, lasting over 30 years, but they achieved what no ruler before him had managed: the complete integration of the Saxon tribes into a larger Germanic confederation. Under Charlemagne's rule, The concept of a unified Germanic empire took its first concrete form. He established schools, promoted literacy, and created a legal system that balanced Germanic traditions with Roman law. His court at Aachen became a beacon of learning where scholars from across Europe gathered to debate theology, philosophy, and statecraft. The palace chapel he built there, with its soaring arches and glittering mosaics, served as a symbol of his dual identity, a Germanic king who had embraced the classical tradition of Rome while remaining true to his people's heritage. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon Charlemagne's head in St. Peter's Basilica. Peter's Basilica in Rome, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. This moment marked not just the revival of the Western Roman Empire, but the birth of what would eventually become the Holy Roman Empire. The Germanic tribes, who had once painted their faces blue and charged naked into battle against Caesar's legions, now provided the emperor who claimed dominion over all of Western Christianity. Yet even as Charlemagne stood at the apex of his power, the seeds of future fragmentation were already taking root. The Germanic tradition of dividing inheritance among all sons conflicted with the Roman concept of imperial succession. When Charlemagne died in 814, his vast empire was too large and too diverse to be ruled by a single heir. His son Louis the Pious attempted to maintain unity, but the cultural and linguistic differences between the various regions proved insurmountable. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 formally divided Charlemagne's empire among his three grandsons. Charles the Bald received the western portion, which would become France. Lothair received the Middle Kingdom, a narrow strip of land from the North Sea to Italy, and Louis the German received the eastern portion, the lands that would eventually become Germany. This division, born of necessity, established the geographical foundation for centuries of conflict and cooperation between the nascent nations of Europe. In the eastern realm of Louis the German, a new chapter in Germanic history began to unfold. The king faced challenges that would test the very foundations of medieval kingship. Viking raiders swept down from the north, Hungarian horsemen thundered across the plains from the east, and local dukes constantly tested royal authority. Yet from these trials emerged a uniquely German form of governance that would influence European politics for 1,000 years. The death of Louis the German in 876 left his kingdom divided among his three sons. But unlike the earlier Frankish divisions, this fragmentation would prove temporary. The German nobles, faced with external threats and internal chaos, began to recognize the need for stronger central authority. They developed a system where the great dukes, rulers of Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Saxony, would elect a king from among their number, creating a balance between regional autonomy and imperial unity. The first great test of this system came with the Magyar invasions of the early 10th century. These Hungarian horsemen, skilled in the art of mounted warfare, devastated the German countryside with their lightning raids. Traditional Frankish military tactics proved inadequate against these mobile warriors, and it seemed that the nascent German kingdom might collapse under the weight of these assaults. But from the Duchy of Saxony emerged a leader who would change the course of German history. Henry the Fowler, so named for his love of hawking, became King of Germany in 919. Unlike his predecessors, Henry understood that defeating the Magyars required not just courage but innovation. He established a network of fortified towns, trained his warriors in new tactics, and most importantly, created a sense of shared German identity that transcended regional loyalties. His victory over the Magyars at the Battle of Riade in 933 marked not just a military triumph, but the birth of German national consciousness. Henry's son Otto would take these foundations and build upon them an empire that would dominate Europe for centuries. Otto I, known to history as Otto the Great, possessed the rare combination of military genius and political acumen that marks truly great rulers. He recognized that the German kingdom's strength lay not in its similarity to other European powers, but in its unique character, a federalized monarchy that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential unity. The rebellion of Otto's younger brother Henry in 939 provided the new king with an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership. Rather than simply crushing the revolt, Otto sought to understand its causes and address the underlying tensions that had sparked it. He reformed the system of duchies, bringing them under closer royal control while still respecting their traditional privileges. This delicate balance between centralization and regional autonomy would become a defining characteristic of German political culture. Otto's most significant achievement was his intervention in Italian politics. The Kingdom of Italy had fallen into chaos following the collapse of Carolingian rule, with various local strongmen competing for power. The Pope, threatened by these secular rulers, appealed to Otto for protection. The German king's subsequent campaigns in Italy were not mere military adventures, but carefully calculated moves to establish German hegemony over all of Western Europe. The Battle of Lechfeld in 955 marked the final defeat of the Magyar threat and established Otto as the protector of Christian Europe. His victory was so complete that the Hungarian tribes abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and settled permanently in the Carpathian Basin, eventually converting to Christianity and becoming allies rather than enemies of the German kingdom. This transformation of foes into friends demonstrated Otto's understanding that true victory lay not in destruction, but in integration. On February 2nd, 962, Pope John XII crowned Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. Peter's Basilica, consciously echoing the coronation of Charlemagne over a century and a half earlier. But this was more than mere repetition. It was the birth of an institution that would shape European politics until the 19th century. The Holy Roman Empire, as it came to be known, represented a unique fusion of Germanic tribal traditions, Roman imperial concepts, and Christian universalism. The empire that Otto created was neither wholly German nor entirely Roman, but something new, a supranational entity that claimed authority over all of Christian Europe while respecting the diverse traditions of its constituent peoples. The German kings who wore the imperial crown would always face the challenge of balancing their role as tribal leaders with their responsibilities as universal emperors. This tension would prove both a source of strength and a cause of weakness throughout the empire's long history. Otto's administrative innovations laid the groundwork for imperial governance that would endure for centuries. He established a system of imperial churches where bishops and abbots held their lands directly from the emperor rather than from local nobles. This created a clerical bureaucracy that could serve as a counterweight to the secular nobility, while also providing the empire with educated administrators who understood both Roman law and Germanic custom. The Empress Adelaide, Otto's second wife, played a crucial role in shaping the cultural identity of the early empire. A woman of remarkable intelligence and political skill, she helped establish the imperial court as a centre of learning and refinement. Under her influence, the German court began to rival Byzantine Constantinople in its sophistication, attracting scholars, artists, and diplomats from across Europe. Her correspondence with the Byzantine empress reveals a woman who understood that true power lay not just in military might, but in cultural influence. The death of Otto I in 973 marked the end of the foundational period of the Holy Roman Empire, but the institution he had created would continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. His son Otto II inherited not just a crown, but a vision of Christian unity that transcended national boundaries. The younger Otto faced challenges that would test every aspect of his father's legacy, from Viking raids in the north to Saracen attacks in the south. Otto II's marriage to the Byzantine princess Theophano represented more than a diplomatic alliance. It was a conscious effort to bridge the divide between Eastern and Western Christianity. Theophano brought to the German court not only the refinement of Byzantine culture, but also an understanding of imperial administration that had been perfected over centuries in Constantinople. Her influence on German court culture was profound, introducing new forms of art, architecture, and ceremonial practice that would distinguish the Holy Roman Empire from its contemporaries. The tragic death of Otto II in 983 at the age of 28 left the empire in the hands of a 3-year-old child, Otto III. The regency that followed, dominated by the dowager empresses Adelaide and Theophano, proved that the empire's strength lay not in any single ruler, but in the institutions and traditions that had been established. These remarkable women maintained imperial authority through a combination of diplomatic skill, administrative competence, and sheer force of personality. When Otto III came of age, he brought to the imperial throne a vision that was both more universal and more specifically German than that of his predecessors. Educated by the brilliant scholar Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II, Otto III conceived of the empire as a renovation of Roman greatness infused with Christian purpose. His establishment of his court in Rome itself, in the ancient imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, symbolized this ambitious synthesis of past and future. The relationship between Otto III and Pope Sylvester II represented the culmination of the medieval ideal of cooperation between spiritual and temporal authority. Gerbert, a man of encyclopedic learning who had studied mathematics in Islamic Spain and astronomy in Byzantine Constantinople, brought to the papal throne an intellectual framework that perfectly complemented Otto's imperial vision. Together, they attempted to create a truly universal Christian empire that would unite all of Europe under the twin banners of faith and reason. Yet even as Otto III reached for universal empire, the particularist traditions of Germany reasserted themselves. The great dukes who had supported his father and grandfather began to question whether their young emperor's attention to Italian and Roman affairs served German interests. The Saxon nobility, in particular, felt that their dynasty's commitment to the imperial crown was drawing resources and attention away from the defence of German territories against Slavic expansion in the east. The sudden death of Otto III in 1002 at the age of 21 ended the direct line of Saxon emperors and opened a new chapter in German history. The succession crisis that followed revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the elective system that had evolved since the time of Henry the Fowler. The great nobles could choose their king, but they could not always agree on their choice, and the process of selection inevitably involved compromises that weakened royal authority. Henry II, the Duke of Bavaria, emerged from this crisis as the new king and emperor. A man of deep religious conviction, he brought to the throne a different vision of imperial authority than his predecessors. Where Otto III had dreamed of universal empire, Henry II focused on the practical task of governing Germany effectively. His canonization by the Catholic Church in 1146 reflected not just his personal piety, but the success of his efforts to create a distinctly German form of Christian kingship. The reign of Henry II marked a turning point in the development of German political culture. He established the principle that the emperor's first responsibility was to his German subjects, and that imperial claims in Italy and elsewhere were secondary to the maintenance of peace and prosperity within the Germanic heartland. This shift in focus would have profound implications for the future development of both the Holy Roman Empire and the emerging German nation. Henry II's marriage to Kunigunde of Luxembourg created a royal partnership that became legendary for its spiritual devotion and political effectiveness. The royal couple's decision to remain celibate, unusual for medieval monarchs, reflected their understanding of kingship as a sacred calling rather than merely a hereditary privilege. Their joint patronage of religious institutions, particularly the magnificent cathedral at Bamberg, demonstrated how imperial power could be used to promote both faith and learning. The Cathedral of Bamberg, which Henry II founded and richly endowed, became a symbol of the synthesis between German imperial power and Christian faith. Its soaring architecture combined elements of Byzantine, Italian and Germanic design, creating a distinctly imperial style that would influence church building throughout the empire. The famous Bamberg Rider, a sculpture of an unknown king that adorned the cathedral, became an icon of medieval German kingship, serene, powerful, and deeply spiritual. When Henry II died in 1024 without an heir, the Saxon dynasty that had ruled Germany for over a century came to an end. The election of Conrad II, Duke of Franconia, marked the beginning of the Salian dynasty and a new phase in the development of German imperial power. Conrad brought to the throne a harder, more pragmatic approach to government than his immediate predecessors, one that would prove better suited to the challenges of the 11th century. The Salian emperors would face trials that would test every aspect of imperial authority. The rise of papal power under Gregory VII, the development of autonomous city-states in Italy, and the growing assertiveness of the German nobility all posed challenges to the traditional balance of power within the empire. Yet these challenges also sparked innovations in government, law, and culture that would ultimately strengthen the Germanic foundation of imperial power. Conrad II's victory over the rebellious Duke Ernst of Swabia in 1030 established important precedents for the relationship between the emperor and the great nobles. Rather than simply crushing the rebellion, Conrad sought to understand its causes and address the legitimate grievances that had sparked it. His reforms of the ducal system created a more centralized form of imperial administration, while still respecting the traditional privileges of the regional nobility. The reign of Conrad II also saw the beginning of German expansion into the Slavic lands of the east. The establishment of marches along the Elbe and Oder rivers created a buffer zone that protected the German heartland while also providing opportunities for colonization and Christianization. This eastern expansion would become a defining characteristic of German history, creating new territories that would eventually be integrated into the empire, while also establishing patterns of cultural interaction that would influence Central European development for centuries. As the first millennium of the Christian era drew to a close, the foundations of German imperial power had been firmly established. The Holy Roman Empire had evolved from the tribal kingdoms of the early medieval period into a sophisticated supranational entity that claimed authority over much of Western and Central Europe. Yet the empire's greatest challenges lay ahead as the forces of religious reform, economic change, and political centralization would test the resilience of the institutions that had been created during these foundational centuries.
The German people, who had begun as scattered tribes in the forests beyond the Rhine, had created an empire that would endure for almost 1,000 years. Their achievement was not merely military or political, but cultural. They had synthesized the tribal traditions of their ancestors with the institutional heritage of Rome and the spiritual vision of Christianity to create something uniquely their own. This synthesis would prove both flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and strong enough to survive the greatest challenges that medieval Europe could present. The story of the early German Empire reveals the complex interplay of personality, circumstance, and institutional development that shapes historical change. From the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Germania to the marble halls of imperial palaces, the German people had traveled a path that few could have imagined when Arminius first raised his sword against the Roman legions. Yet each step along this path, each victory and defeat, each moment of triumph and crisis, had contributed to the creation of an imperial tradition that would influence European development for centuries to come. As Conrad II consolidated his power and prepared to pass the crown to his son Henry III, the German Empire stood at a crossroads. The achievements of the past had created a foundation for future greatness, but the challenges of the future would require new forms of leadership and new solutions to ancient problems. The boy who would become Henry III would inherit not just a crown but a legacy of innovation, adaptation, and above all, the uniquely German gift for creating unity from diversity. The empire that had emerged from the tribal councils of the early medieval period was ready to face the challenges of a new age, confident in its traditions but flexible enough to embrace the changes that the ancient crown of Charlemagne, once bright with the promise of eternal unity, began to tarnish under the weight of centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, that magnificent dream of a Christian realm stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, found itself fracturing along invisible lines of ambition and faith. In the shadows of this slow dissolution, a new power stirred in. The cold marshlands of the northeast, where the Hohenzollern eagles would soon spread their wings over a destiny no emperor could have foreseen. The 17th century descended upon the German lands like a storm that would not break. The 30 Years' War had left scars deeper than any battlefield could show entire regions depopulated, cities reduced to skeletal remains, and the very concept of German unity torn asunder by religious division. In this landscape of sorrow, the Holy Roman Empire existed more as a memory than a reality, its institutions hollow echoes of medieval grandeur. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 had formally recognized what every German prince already knew. The empire was no longer an empire in any meaningful sense. The treaty granted the German princes the right to conduct their own foreign policy, to maintain their own armies, and to govern their territories as sovereign rulers. The emperor in Vienna, still wearing the crown of Charlemagne, had become little more than a figurehead presiding over a collection of independent states that happened to share a common language and ancient history. Yet, in this apparent weakness lay a strange kind of strength. The German princes, freed from the constraints of imperial authority, began to experiment with new forms of governance. Some, like the Elector of Saxony, patronized the arts and sciences, creating courts that rivaled Versailles in their splendor. Others, like the Margrave of Brandenburg, turned their attention to the more practical matters of administration and military organization. It was as if the great German tree, having lost its central trunk, was sending up shoots in every direction, each seeking its own path toward the sun. The most significant of these shoots emerged in the cold, sandy soil of Brandenburg, Prussia. Here, in a land that seemed to offer nothing but pine forests and marshes, a dynasty of remarkable rulers began to forge something entirely new. The Hohenzollern family, originally from southern Germany, had acquired the electorate of Brandenburg in 1415. For 2 centuries, they had governed this modest territory with quiet competence, gradually expanding their holdings through marriage, diplomacy, and occasional military action. The transformation of Brandenburg, Prussia, from a backwater electorate into a major European power began with Friedrich Wilhelm, known to history as the Great Elector. When he inherited the throne in 1640, his scattered territories were devastated by war, his treasury empty, and his army barely worthy of the name. Yet in this apparent hopelessness, Friedrich Wilhelm saw opportunity. The very weakness of his position freed him from the constraints that bound more established powers. He could innovate, adapt, and create new institutions without the burden of ancient traditions. The great elector's first innovation was the creation of a standing army. While other German princes relied on mercenaries and feudal levies, Friedrich Wilhelm established permanent military units trained in the latest techniques of warfare. This army was small by the standards of France or Austria, but it was disciplined, well-equipped, and absolutely loyal to the Hohenzollern crown. More importantly, it was supported by an efficient administrative system that could extract the maximum resources from Brandenburg, Prussia's limited territory. The administrative reforms of the Great Elector created a new kind of state in Central Europe. Unlike the loose feudal structures that still dominated much of Germany, Brandenburg, Prussia became a centralized monarchy where power flowed directly from the ruler to his appointed officials. The nobility retained their social privileges, but lost their political independence. The peasantry, while still bound to the land, found themselves protected by royal law rather than subject to the arbitrary will of local lords. This system, which historians would later call enlightened absolutism, proved remarkably effective. The Great Elector's successors continued to refine and expand his innovations. Friedrich I, who crowned himself king in Prussia in 1701, transformed the court at Berlin into a center of learning and culture. The king patronized philosophers, scientists, and artists, creating an intellectual atmosphere that would eventually produce figures like Immanuel Kant and Johann Sebastian Bach. Yet it was Friedrich II, known as Frederick the Great, who truly established Prussia as a major European power. When he ascended the throne in 1740, the young king inherited a state that was efficient, well-organized, and militarily formidable. He also inherited a burning ambition to expand Prussian territory and influence. His opportunity came with the death of Emperor Charles VI and the succession of his daughter, Maria Theresa, to the Habsburg throne. The War of the Austrian Succession began in 1740 when Frederick invaded Silesia, one of the richest provinces of the Habsburg domains. The attack was swift, decisive, and completely unexpected. While the rest of Europe debated the legality of Maria Theresa's succession, Frederick had already occupied Silesia and was fortifying his position. The young empress, faced with enemies on every front, was forced to accept the loss of her wealthy province in exchange for Frederick's recognition of her imperial title. The conquest of Silesia transformed Prussia from a regional power into a player on the European stage. The province's mineral wealth, skilled craftsmen, and strategic location made it invaluable to the Prussian crown. More importantly, Frederick's bold action demonstrated that Prussia was willing and able to challenge the established order. The other German princes who had long deferred to Habsburg authority began to look to Berlin as an alternative center of power. Frederick's military genius became legendary throughout Europe. His innovations in tactics, logistics, and military organization created an army that could defeat forces twice its size. The oblique order of battle, which concentrated maximum force at the enemy's weakest point, became the standard tactical formation for the next century. The Prussian General Staff, with its emphasis on careful planning and rapid execution, would serve as a model for military organizations throughout the world. Yet, Frederick's greatness lay not merely in his military achievements but in his understanding of Prussia's unique position in the German world. Unlike Austria, which was a multinational empire with interests throughout Europe, Prussia was fundamentally a German state. Its expansion came primarily at the expense of other German territories, and its culture remained distinctly Germanic, even as it absorbed influences from France and other European powers. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, tested Prussia's strength to the breaking point. Frederick faced a coalition that included Austria, France, Russia, and most of the smaller German states. For 7 years, Prussian armies fought desperately against overwhelming odds, sometimes achieving brilliant victories, sometimes suffering crushing defeats. The war's conclusion left Prussia financially exhausted and militarily weakened, but it had survived the ultimate test. The other European powers now recognized Prussia as a permanent member of the elite club of great powers. The French Revolution of 1789 struck the German lands like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. Suddenly, the ancient certainties of monarchy, nobility, and religious authority seemed to crumble before the radical ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The German princes, watching in horror as their French counterparts fled into exile or met the guillotine, began to understand that their own world was changing in ways they could neither predict nor control. The revolution's impact on Germany was immediate and profound. French revolutionary agents crossed the Rhine, spreading radical pamphlets and organizing political clubs in the German cities. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened by centuries of decline, found itself facing an existential crisis. The traditional bonds of loyalty and obligation that had held the empire together began to dissolve under the pressure of new ideologies that proclaimed the sovereignty of the people and the illegitimacy of hereditary rule. Emperor Leopold II, who had succeeded his brother Joseph II in 1790, recognized the revolutionary threat to the established order. He began to organize a coalition of European powers to restore the French monarchy and contain the spread of revolutionary ideas. The Declaration of Pillnitz, issued jointly by Austria and Prussia in 1791, warned that the European powers would intervene if the French royal family was harmed. This declaration, intended as a diplomatic gesture, instead provoked the revolutionary government in Paris to declare war on Austria in April 1792. The French Revolutionary Wars began with high expectations on both sides. The Austrian and Prussian armies, confident in their professional superiority, expected to crush the revolutionary forces and march triumphantly to Paris. The French revolutionaries, inspired by their new ideology of popular sovereignty, believed that their citizen soldiers would prove superior to the mercenary armies of the old regime. Both sides were partially correct, but neither anticipated the length and intensity of the conflict that would engulf Europe for the next 2 decades. The early campaigns revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both systems. The coalition armies were better trained, better equipped, and more experienced than their French opponents. However, they were also constrained by the limited objectives of 18th century warfare. The Austrian and Prussian commanders sought to achieve political goals through military means, but they were not prepared for the total war that revolutionary France was willing to wage. The French armies, meanwhile, suffered from inexperience and poor organization. Many of their noble officers had emigrated, leaving the army in the hands of promoted sergeants and enthusiastic volunteers. Yet these citizen soldiers fought with a passion and determination that their professional opponents could not match. They were defending not just their homeland, but their revolution, their newfound freedom, and their vision of a new world order. The Battle of Valmy in September 1792 marked a turning point in the conflict. The Prussian army, advancing toward Paris, encountered a French force near the village of Valmy. The engagement itself was little more than an extended artillery duel, but its psychological impact was enormous. The French citizen soldiers had stood firm against the finest army in Europe, and the Prussians, faced with stiffening resistance and supply problems, decided to withdraw. The German writer Goethe, who witnessed the battle, reportedly said, "From this place and from this day forth commences a new era in the world's history." The French victory at Valmy encouraged the revolutionary government to proclaim the Republic and to export their revolution to other European countries. French armies crossed the Rhine and occupied the German territories on the left bank. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened by internal divisions, found itself unable to mount an effective resistance. The smaller German states, caught between the advancing French and the retreating Austrians, began to question their loyalty to the empire. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 shocked the German princes and convinced them that the French Revolution posed an existential threat to the European order. The First Coalition, which included Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and most of the smaller German states, formed to contain the revolutionary threat. Yet the coalition suffered from the same problems that had plagued German unity for centuries: competing interests, poor coordination, and the absence of a unified command structure. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte transformed the conflict from a war of ideology into a struggle for European domination. The young Corsican general combined the revolutionary energy of the French people with his own military genius to create a war machine unlike anything Europe had seen since the days of Alexander the Great. Napoleon's victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram shattered the old European order and forced the German princes to confront the reality of French hegemony. The Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805 was perhaps the most decisive engagement of the entire Napoleonic period. Napoleon, facing the combined armies of Austria and Russia, achieved a victory so complete that it effectively ended the Third Coalition. The Austrian Emperor Francis II, recognizing the impossibility of maintaining the fiction of the Holy Roman Empire, formally dissolved the 1,000-year-old institution in 1806. The crown of Charlemagne, which had symbolized German unity for so many centuries, was quietly retired to the imperial treasury in Vienna. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire created a power vacuum in Central Europe that Napoleon was quick to exploit. The Confederation of the Rhine, established in 1806, brought together 16 German states under French protection. The Confederation included major powers like Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony, as well as smaller territories that had been reorganized and consolidated under French supervision. For the first time since the days of Charlemagne, a significant portion of German territory was united under a single political framework. Yet this unity came at a terrible price. The German princes who joined the Confederation of the Rhine were forced to provide troops for Napoleon's armies, to contribute to the French treasury, and to implement the continental system that sought to exclude British trade from Europe. The traditional German institutions, the imperial diet, the imperial courts, the ancient privileges of the free cities, were swept away and replaced by French administrative models. Prussia, which had refused to join the Confederation of the Rhine, paid an even higher price for its independence. The disastrous campaign of 1806 to 1807 saw the Prussian army, once the pride of Europe, crushed in a series of engagements that culminated in the twin defeats of Jena and Auerstedt. King Frederick William III fled to Königsberg, while French troops occupied Berlin and imposed a crushing peace settlement that reduced Prussia to a rump state confined to its eastern territories. The Peace of Tilsit, signed in July 1807, represented the nadir of Prussian power. Napoleon, meeting with Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, divided Europe into spheres of influence. Prussia lost nearly half its territory, including all its Polish possessions and most of its German territories west of the Elbe. The Prussian army was limited to 42,000 men, a fraction of its former size, and the kingdom was forced to pay crushing war indemnities to France. Yet even in this darkest hour, the seeds of Prussian revival were being sown. The military reforms of Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau transformed the Prussian army from a rigid, aristocratic institution into a modern meritocratic force. The administrative reforms of Karl von Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg modernized the Prussian state and created new bonds between the government and the people. The educational reforms of Wilhelm von Humboldt established a system of public education that would make Prussia one of the most literate societies in Europe. These reforms, known collectively as the Prussian reforms, were far more than mere administrative changes. They represented a fundamental transformation of Prussian society and politics. The rigid caste system that had characterized the old regime was replaced by a more flexible social order based on merit and achievement. The peasantry was freed from serfdom, creating a class of independent farmers who had a stake in the success of the state. The middle class was given new opportunities for advancement in the civil service, the army, and the professions. The invasion of Russia in 1812 marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall and the resurrection of German hopes for independence. The Grande Armée, which had crossed the Niemen with over 600,000 men, returned as a frozen, starving rabble numbering fewer than 30,000 effective soldiers. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered in the snows of Russia, and the German princes began to calculate whether the moment had come to break free from French domination. The first to act was Prussia. General Ludwig Yorck, commanding the Prussian auxiliary corps in Napoleon's army, signed the Convention of Taragon with the Russians in December 1812. This neutrality agreement, concluded without authorization from Berlin, marked Prussia's first step toward joining the anti-French coalition. King Frederick William III, initially furious at York's insubordination, soon realized that his general had provided him with the opportunity he had been seeking for years. The Prussian declaration of war against France in March 1813 was accompanied by an extraordinary outpouring of patriotic sentiment. The Appeal to My People, issued by Frederick William III, called upon all Prussians to take up arms against the French oppressor. Young men from all social classes volunteered for service in the Landwehr, the citizen militia that supplemented the regular army. The universities closed as students and professors alike joined the colors. The elderly Baron von Stein, who had been living in exile in Russia, returned to help organize the resistance. The War of Liberation, as the Germans called it, was unlike any previous conflict in European history. For the first time, the German people were fighting not for the narrow interests of their princes, but for the broader concept of German freedom and independence. The volunteer battalions, known as Freikorps, were composed of men from all walks of life united by their hatred of foreign domination. The black, red, and gold colors of the Lutzow Free Corps became symbols of German nationalism that would resonate throughout the 19th century. The early campaigns of 1813 saw mixed results for the coalition forces. Napoleon, demonstrating his old genius, won several battles against the Allied armies in Germany. The victories at Lutzen and Bautzen showed that the French emperor was still capable of brilliant tactical combinations. However, these successes came at a terrible cost in casualties that Napoleon could no longer afford. The French army, stripped of its best officers and veteran soldiers by years of constant warfare, could no longer sustain the kind of losses that had once been acceptable. The turning point came with Austria's entry into the war in August 1813. Emperor Francis I, Napoleon's father-in-law, had long sought to remain neutral in the conflict between France and the other European powers. However, the prospect of a restored French hegemony in Europe was too dangerous to ignore. The Austrian army, reformed and reorganized since the disasters of 1805 and 1809, provided the coalition with the additional strength needed to defeat Napoleon decisively. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, was the largest engagement of the entire Napoleonic period. Nearly 500,000 soldiers from across Europe converged on the Saxon city in a three-day struggle that would determine the fate of the continent. The coalition forces, commanded by Prince Schwarzenberg of Austria, gradually overwhelmed the French army through sheer weight of numbers. Napoleon, recognizing that his position was hopeless, ordered a retreat that quickly became a rout. The retreat from Leipzig marked the end of French domination in Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed as its member states hastily switched sides to join the victorious coalition. The French garrisons in German cities found themselves isolated and besieged. Napoleon himself, pursued by the Allied armies, was forced to fall back across the Rhine and defend French territory for the first time in 20 years. The German princes, liberated from French control, now faced the question of what would replace. The collapsed Confederation of the Rhine. The Holy Roman Empire was gone forever, but some form of German unity seemed both necessary and inevitable. The Congress of Vienna, which convened in 1814 to reorganize Europe, would have to address the German question along with the many other territorial and political issues left in the wake of Napoleon's defeat. The Prussian reformers, led by Hardenberg and Humboldt, advocated for a unified German state under Prussian leadership. They argued that the wars of liberation had demonstrated the German people's desire for unity and that only a strong, centralized state could prevent future foreign domination. The Austrian Chancellor Metternich, however, preferred a loose confederation that would preserve Austrian influence while preventing the emergence of a unified German rival. The smaller German states, caught between these competing visions, generally favored the Austrian approach. They had no desire to exchange French domination for Prussian control, and they feared that a unified Germany would reduce them to the status of mere provinces. The particularist traditions that had shaped German politics for centuries remained strong, even in the aftermath of the Liberation Wars. The final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in June 1815 ensured that the German question would be resolved by the victorious Allies rather than by the French Emperor. The Congress of Vienna, which had been interrupted by Napoleon's return during the 100 Days, resumed its work with renewed determination. The German settlement that emerged from these negotiations would shape Central European politics for the next half-century. The German Confederation, established by the final act of the Congress of Vienna, was a compromise that satisfied none of the major parties completely. It was more than the loose alliance that Metternich had originally envisioned, but far less than the unified state that the Prussian reformers had sought. The Confederation included 39 German states, ranging from the great powers of Austria and Prussia to tiny principalities with fewer than 50,000 inhabitants. The Diet of the German Confederation, meeting in Frankfurt, was designed to coordinate policy among the member states while preserving their individual sovereignty. Austria, as the largest German power, held the permanent presidency of the Diet, while Prussia and the other major states held significant influence through their voting rights. The smaller states, despite their numerical superiority, found themselves largely excluded from real power in the new system. The Frankfurt Diet represented the institutionalization of German dualism, the rivalry between Austria and Prussia for leadership of the German-speaking peoples. This competition, which had been a feature of German politics since the rise of Prussia in the 18th century, now became the central dynamic of the new confederation. Every major issue, from trade policy to military organization, became a test of strength between Vienna and Berlin. The Restoration of 1815 brought peace to Germany after 25 years of almost constant warfare. The old boundaries were largely restored. The traditional dynasties returned to their thrones, and the ancient privileges of the nobility were confirmed. Yet beneath this appearance of restoration, profound changes had occurred. The German people had experienced national unity under French rule, had fought together in the wars of liberation, and had been exposed to the revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality. These experiences could not be undone by diplomatic treaties or conservative policies. The young generation that had grown up during the Napoleonic period carried with them memories of German unity and dreams of German freedom. They had seen what could be accomplished when the German people were united behind a common cause, and they were determined to achieve that unity under German rather than foreign leadership. The student organizations, the gymnastic societies, and the various cultural movements that emerged in the post-war period all reflected this new German national consciousness. The economic changes of the period were equally significant. The continental system, despite its ultimate failure, had forced the German states to develop their own industries and to create new patterns of trade within Central Europe. The removal of internal tariffs and the standardization of weights and measures had created the foundation for economic integration that would eventually lead to political unity. Prussia, in particular, had benefited from these economic changes. The kingdom's location at the center of the German world, its efficient administrative system, and its growing industrial base made it the natural leader of German economic development. The Prussian Customs Union, established in 1818, gradually attracted other German states and created a zone of free trade that excluded Austria and challenged Habsburg influence in Germany. The stage was now set for the final act in the drama of German unification. The forces unleashed by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, nationalism, liberalism, and economic integration would continue to work beneath the surface of the restored order. The German Confederation, designed to preserve the balance of power and prevent the emergence of a unified German state, would instead become the arena in which the struggle for German unity would be played out. As the sun set over the battlefields of Waterloo, it illuminated a transformed German landscape. The old Holy Roman Empire lay in ruins, its ancient institutions scattered like leaves before the wind. In its place stood a new generation of German states, tested by war and tempered by adversity. The Prussian eagle, once confined to the cold marshes of Brandenburg, now cast its shadow across half of Germany. The Austrian double-headed eagle, though still proud and powerful, found itself challenged by forces it could neither fully understand nor completely control. The German people, having tasted both the bitterness of foreign domination and the sweetness of liberation, would not long be content with the compromise of 1815. In the universities and the coffee houses, in the chambers of commerce and the meeting halls of the guilds, new ideas were stirring. The concept of a unified German nation, once the dream of romantic poets and political theorists, was becoming the aspiration of practical men and women who understood that the future belonged to those who could unite the German people behind a common cause. The winds of change were blowing across the German lands, carrying with them the seeds of a new order. The question was no longer whether Germany would be unified, but how that unity would be achieved and under whose leadership. The answer would determine not only the fate of the German people, but the balance of power in Europe for generations to come. In the gathering dusk of the Old World, the dawn of the new German Empire was beginning to break. The winds of change that had swept across Europe in Napoleon's wake settled into a different rhythm after 1815, where once the thunder of cannons had echoed across the German lands. Now came the quieter, more persistent sound of diplomatic quills scratching across parchment. The Congress of Vienna, that grand gathering of Europe's most powerful minds, had redrawn the map of the continent with careful deliberation, and from their negotiations emerged a new framework for the German states, the German Confederation. In the ornate chambers of Vienna, where crystal chandeliers cast their gentle glow over mahogany tables laden with maps and treaties, the architects of post-Napoleonic Europe crafted what they hoped would be a lasting peace. The German Confederation, or Deutscher Bund, emerged from these discussions not as the unified nation that German patriots had dreamed of, but as a loose association of 39 sovereign states, each jealously guarding its independence while bound together by the threads of mutual necessity. At its heart lay an inherent tension that would define the next half-century of German history. The Confederation was designed to be strong enough to provide security against foreign threats, yet weak enough to preserve the autonomy of its member states. This delicate balance was embodied in the Federal Assembly, or Bundestag, which convened in the ancient city of Frankfurt am Main. Here, representatives from kingdoms, duchies, and free cities gathered to debate matters of common concern, their voices echoing through chambers that had witnessed centuries of German political discourse. The presidency of this confederation fell naturally to Austria, the German-speaking empire that had long claimed leadership of the German peoples. The Austrian Emperor, Francis I, accepted this role with the grave dignity befitting his station, understanding that his empire's influence over the German states was both an honor and a burden. Through his skilled diplomats, particularly the calculating Prince Metternich, Austria sought to maintain the status quo that had emerged from Vienna's negotiations. Yet within this carefully constructed system, seeds of future conflict were already taking root. Prussia, that northern kingdom forged in the crucible of military necessity, had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars with enhanced prestige and territory. The addition of the Rhineland to Prussian dominion had not only expanded the kingdom's borders, but had also given it control over some of the most economically vital regions in the German lands. Coal deposits and emerging industrial centers now flew the black and white flag of the Hohenzollerns, providing Prussia with resources that would prove crucial in the decades to come. The Prussian court in Berlin, while outwardly accepting Austrian leadership of the Confederation, harbored ambitions that grew with each passing year. King Frederick William III, though personally modest and introspective, presided over a state apparatus that was becoming increasingly efficient and powerful. The Prussian military, reformed and modernized during the Liberation Wars, maintained its reputation for discipline and innovation. More importantly, the kingdom's administrative system, with its emphasis on merit and efficiency, provided a model of governance that contrasted sharply with the more traditional approaches favored by Austria and the smaller German states. As the 1820s unfolded, the German Confederation faced its first major test in the form of liberal and nationalist movements that bubbled up from universities and intellectual circles. The memory of the Liberation Wars had awakened a sense of German identity that transcended the borders of individual states. Young men who had fought side by side against Napoleon returned to their homes with a broader vision of what Germany could become. They gathered in student associations or Burschenschaften, where they discussed philosophy, politics, and the possibility of a unified German nation. These movements alarmed the conservative leadership of the Confederation, particularly Prince Metternich, who saw in every liberal gathering the seeds of revolution. The assassination of the playwright August von Kotzebue by a radical student in 1819 provided the pretext for a crackdown that would define the Confederation's approach to political dissent for the next generation. The Carlsbad Decrees, enacted with swift efficiency, imposed strict censorship on universities and the press, while establishing a network of surveillance that would monitor potential subversives across the German states. The implementation of co-tension of these measures revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Confederation. When the various governments acted in concert, they could indeed suppress dissent with remarkable effectiveness. Liberal professors found themselves dismissed from their positions. Student organizations were disbanded, and newspapers discovered that their editors faced imprisonment for writings that challenged the established order. Yet this very success in maintaining political stability came at the cost of stifling the intellectual and cultural dynamism that had begun to flourish in the post-Napoleonic period. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of political repression, profound economic changes were transforming the German landscape. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain and spread to France and the Low Countries, gradually took root in the German states. The Rhineland, now under Prussian control, became a center of coal mining and iron production. The rhythmic hammering of steam engines began to echo through valleys that had previously known only the gentle sounds of agriculture and traditional crafts. This industrial development created new social classes whose interests would increasingly challenge the traditional order. A growing bourgeoisie of merchants, manufacturers, and professionals began to accumulate wealth and influence that rivaled that of the old aristocracy. These new elites, while often conservative in their personal outlook, harbored ambitions for political participation that the existing system could not accommodate. Their businesses, moreover, suffered from the fragmented nature of the German states, each with its own currency, customs regulations, and legal systems. The formation of the Prussian-led Zollverein, or Customs Union, in 1834 represented a crucial step toward German economic integration. This arrangement, which gradually expanded to include most of the German states except Austria, created a common market that facilitated trade and industrial development. The sight of goods flowing freely across borders that had once required costly customs inspections provided a tangible preview of what political unification might accomplish. For Austria, the Zollverein represented both an opportunity and a threat. While Habsburg territories were invited to join, the empire's diverse economy, which included agricultural regions in Hungary and industrial centers in Bohemia, made full participation difficult. Austrian officials watched with growing concern as Prussia's economic influence over the German states expanded, recognizing that commercial ties often preceded political ones. As the 1840s dawned, the German Confederation faced mounting pressures that would test its ability to maintain stability. The Hungry 40s, as this decade came to be known, brought economic hardship that affected all levels of society. Poor harvests led to food shortages, while the emerging industrial economy struggled with periodic crises that left workers unemployed and businesses bankrupt. These material hardships provided fertile ground for the growth of political movements that challenged the existing order. The situation was further complicated by the accession of new rulers whose views differed from those of their predecessors. In Prussia, Frederick William IV ascended to the throne in 1840, with romantic notions of German unity that both inspired and alarmed his contemporaries. Unlike his pragmatic father, the new king was given to grand gestures and mystical visions of a renewed German empire. His initial liberalizing measures, including the relaxation of censorship and the promise of constitutional reform, raised hopes among German nationalists while causing anxiety in Vienna. The intellectual climate of the 1840s also contributed to the growing tension within the Confederation. The rise of scientific thinking and historical scholarship challenged traditional justifications for political authority. German philosophers and historians, particularly those influenced by the ideas of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, began to articulate theories of national development that portrayed the existing Fragmentation of Germany as an obstacle to the nations. Historic destiny. The year 1848 arrived like a thunderclap across the European continent, and the German states were not immune to its electrifying effects. The February Revolution in Paris, which toppled the July monarchy and established the Second French Republic, sent shockwaves through the carefully constructed order that had prevailed since 1815. News of barricades in Parisian streets and the flight of King Louis Philippe reached German cities with the speed of the new telegraph lines, carrying with it the intoxicating possibility that the age of absolute monarchy was finally drawing to a close. In the German states, the revolutionary wave began almost simultaneously in several locations, as if the entire region had been waiting for this moment. The Grand Duchy of Baden, long a center of liberal sentiment, saw some of the earliest demonstrations. Here, in the small towns and cities nestled in the Rhine Valley, citizens gathered in market squares to demand constitutional government and expanded political rights. Their voices, raised in passionate speeches and patriotic songs, echoed through cobblestone streets that had witnessed centuries of more subdued political discourse. The revolution reached its most dramatic expression in Berlin, where the Prussian capital became the stage for events that would reshape the kingdom's relationship with its subjects. On March 13, 1848, crowds gathered before the royal palace, their numbers swelling throughout the day as word spread of the king's promise to consider liberal reforms. The atmosphere was initially festive, with citizens singing patriotic songs and displaying the black, red, and gold colors that had become symbols of German unity. However, the situation deteriorated rapidly when nervous troops opened fire on the crowd, killing several demonstrators and transforming what had been a peaceful gathering into a scene of chaos and bloodshed. The cobblestones of Berlin's streets, worn smooth by centuries of use, became slippery with blood as citizens and soldiers engaged in desperate combat. Barricades rose throughout the city, constructed from overturned carriages, paving stones, and whatever materials the insurgents could find. King Frederick William IV, faced with a crisis that threatened to engulf his kingdom, found himself caught between his romantic notions of German unity and his practical need to maintain royal authority. In a gesture that shocked his military advisors, he ordered the withdrawal of troops from Berlin and appeared before the crowd wearing the revolutionary colors. His promise to lead the movement for German unification seemed to offer a path forward that could satisfy both liberal aspirations and monarchical authority. Similar scenes played out across the German states, from the ancient cities of Saxony to the prosperous commercial centers of the Rhineland. In Vienna, the revolutionary wave reached even the heart of the Austrian Empire, forcing the resignation of Prince Metternich, the architect of the conservative system that had dominated European politics for a generation. The prince's flight to London marked the end of an era and seemed to herald the triumph of liberal and nationalist forces throughout the German lands. The most ambitious expression of the revolutionary spirit came with the convening of the Frankfurt Parliament, or National Assembly, in May 1848. Representatives from across the German states gathered in the Paulskirche, a Protestant church in Frankfurt am Main that had been converted into a meeting hall for this historic occasion. The building's Gothic architecture, with its soaring arches and stained glass windows, provided a fitting backdrop for debates that would determine the future of the German nation. The parliament's composition reflected the intellectual and professional classes that had driven the revolutionary movement. Lawyers, professors, journalists, and businessmen filled the pews that had once held ordinary worshippers, their voices rising in passionate debate about fundamental questions of national identity and political organization. The presence of so many learned men in one place led observers to dub the assembly the Parliament of Professors, though this characterization understated the practical political experience that many representatives possessed. The central question facing the Parliament was whether the new German nation should follow the Greater German solution, which would include the German-speaking portions of the Austrian Empire, or the Lesser German approach, which would exclude Austria and create a smaller but more cohesive nation under Prussian leadership. This debate revealed deep divisions not only about the geographical boundaries of Germany, but also about the kind of society the new nation should become. Supporters of the Greater German solution argued that all German-speaking peoples should be united under a single government, regardless of their current political affiliations. They pointed to the cultural and linguistic ties that bound Germans from Hamburg to Trieste, from Cologne to Prague. Their vision was of a vast Central European empire that would rival France and Russia in power and influence, drawing strength from the diversity of its peoples and the richness of its resources. Advocates of the Lesser German approach, however, argued that the inclusion of Austria would create more problems than it solved. The Austrian Empire's multi-ethnic character, they contended, would dilute German identity and create irreconcilable conflicts within the new nation. Moreover, they pointed out that Austria's extensive non-German territories would inevitably draw the new Germany into conflicts and commitments that had little to do with German national interests. While the Parliament debated these fundamental questions, the revolutionary momentum that had brought it into existence gradually began to dissipate. The initial euphoria of the March revolutions gave way to more sober assessments of the challenges involved in creating a unified German nation. The existing governments, having recovered from their initial shock, began to reassert their authority and roll back the concessions they had made during the revolutionary crisis. In Berlin, King Frederick William IV's enthusiasm for leading the German unification movement cooled as he faced pressure from his military advisors and conservative nobles. The king's romantic temperament, which had initially made him sympathetic to nationalist aspirations, now led him to envision a restored German empire that would be fundamentally different from the democratic nation-state that the Frankfurt Parliament was attempting to create. The Austrian government, meanwhile, worked systematically to undermine the Parliament's authority while rebuilding its own power. The young Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ascended to the throne during the revolutionary crisis, proved to be a skilled politician who understood the importance of combining concessions with firmness. His government's suppression of revolutionary movements in Hungary and Bohemia demonstrated that the Habsburg monarchy retained the will and ability to defend its interests. The Parliament's most significant achievement was the drafting of a constitution for the new German nation, a document that reflected the liberal and democratic values of its authors. The Constitution provided for a federal system that would balance national unity with respect for regional diversity. It included extensive guarantees of individual rights and established the principle that government authority derived from the consent of the governed rather than from divine right or historical tradition. However, the Constitution's most crucial provision concerned the position of the German emperor, who would serve as the head of the new nation. After extensive debate, the Parliament chose to offer this position to King Frederick William IV of Prussia, recognizing that Prussian military and economic power would be essential for the success of the unification project. The decision to exclude Austria from the new nation, while painful for many delegates, reflected the practical reality that the Habsburg Empire's interests were fundamentally incompatible with the creation of a unified German nation-state. The moment of truth came in April 1849, when a delegation from the Frankfurt Parliament traveled to Berlin to offer the imperial crown to Frederick William IV. The ceremony, held in the Prussian capital's royal palace, was intended to mark the birth of a new German nation. The delegates, wearing their formal parliamentary robes, approached the king with the solemnity appropriate to such a historic occasion. Frederick William IV's response, however, shattered the hopes of German liberals and nationalists. The king rejected the crown, declaring that he could not accept an honor that came from a popular assembly rather than from his fellow monarchs. His reference to the crown as one picked up from the gutter revealed the deep contempt that traditional authorities felt for the democratic legitimacy that the parliament represented. The king's rejection of the imperial crown marked the beginning of the end for the revolutionary movement of 1848. Without Prussian support, the Frankfurt Parliament lacked the military power necessary to implement its vision of German unity. The Assembly's remaining members, increasingly isolated and powerless, watched helplessly as the old order reasserted itself across the German states. The final phase of the revolutionary period witnessed a series of desperate uprisings as radical Democrats attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of their hopes. In the Rhineland, Baden, and Saxony, Republican forces took up arms against the restored monarchies, proclaiming their loyalty to the Frankfurt Constitution and their determination to create a democratic Germany. These movements, however, lacked the popular support and resources necessary to challenge the professional armies of the German states. The suppression of these final revolutionary outbreaks was swift and decisive. Prussian and Austrian troops, working in coordination, crushed the remaining centers of resistance with the efficiency that had made them feared throughout Europe. The fortress of Rastatt, the last stronghold of the Baden revolutionaries, fell. After a brief siege, and with it ended the hope that the German nation could be unified through popular revolution. The failure of the 1848 revolution had profound consequences for the future of German unification. The attempt to create a unified nation through democratic means had failed, discrediting liberal and nationalist politicians who had staked their careers on the Frankfurt Parliament's success. The events of 1848 to 1849 demonstrated that the existing German states, particularly Prussia and Austria, possessed the military strength and political will necessary to resist popular challenges to their authority. Yet the revolutionary experience also revealed the depth of German national feeling and the practical obstacles to maintaining the status quo. The enthusiastic response to the call for German unity, the willingness of ordinary citizens to risk their lives for the cause, and the sophisticated constitutional framework developed by the Frankfurt Parliament all demonstrated that the idea of a unified German nation had taken deep root in the consciousness of the German people. More importantly, the revolution highlighted the central role that Prussia would need to play in any future unification effort. The Frankfurt Parliament's decision to offer the imperial crown to Frederick William IV reflected the recognition that Prussian power was essential for German unity. While the king had rejected the crown when it came from a popular assembly, the possibility remained that he might accept it under different circumstances. In the aftermath of the failed revolution, as the German state settled back into the familiar patterns of conservative governance, a new figure began to emerge on the political stage whose name would become synonymous with the eventual unification of Germany. Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian junker whose family had served the Hohenzollern dynasty for generations, appeared to many contemporaries as merely another representative of the reactionary forces that had triumphed over the liberal aspirations of 1848. Born in 1815 at the estate of Schönhausen, in the sandy plains of Brandenburg, Bismarck had grown up in the rural environment that shaped the worldview of the Prussian nobility. His family's modest estate, with its sprawling manor house and carefully tended fields, represented the traditional foundation of Prussian power, the alliance between the monarchy and the landed aristocracy that had enabled the kingdom to rise from obscurity to great power status. That the young Bismarck's education followed the path typical of his class. He studied at the University of Göttingen, where he developed a reputation for dueling and drinking that concerned his professors more than his academic performance. His early letters home revealed a restless, ambitious young man who chafed against the constraints of provincial life while lacking a clear sense of direction for his considerable energies. After completing his studies, Bismarck briefly pursued a career in the Prussian civil service, that efficient bureaucracy that had become the backbone of the kingdom's administration. However, the routine duties of a junior administrator failed to engage his interest, and he soon returned to manage his family's estates. For nearly a decade, he lived the life of a country gentleman, overseeing agricultural operations and participating in local politics with the dedication of a man who had found his proper place in the world. The revolutionary crisis of 1848 marked the beginning of Bismarck's transformation from a provincial nobleman into one of Europe's most influential statesmen. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were shocked by the sudden collapse of the old order, Bismarck viewed the revolutionary upheaval as an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty to the monarchy and his understanding of political reality. During the March crisis in Berlin, while King Frederick William IV wavered between his romantic sympathies for German nationalism and his practical need to maintain royal authority, Bismarck offered to lead a military expedition to rescue the monarch from the revolutionary crowds. His proposal, though ultimately rejected, demonstrated the kind of decisive action that would characterize his later career. More importantly, Bismarck's analysis of the revolutionary situation revealed the strategic thinking that would make him one of the most effective practitioners of power politics in the 19th century. While liberals celebrated the apparent triumph of popular sovereignty, Bismarck recognized that the real question was which of the existing powers would ultimately benefit from the redistribution of authority that the revolution had initiated. His entry into national politics came through his election to the Prussian Parliament in 1847, where he quickly established himself as one of the most articulate defenders of traditional monarchical authority. His speeches, delivered with the confidence of a man who believed completely in the righteousness of his cause, combined intellectual sophistication with emotional appeal in ways that made him a formidable parliamentary opponent. Bismarck's political philosophy during this period was fundamentally conservative, rooted in the belief that legitimate government derived from historical tradition rather than popular consent. He viewed the monarchy not as an arbitrary institution, but as the embodiment of the Prussian state's historical mission. This perspective enabled him to defend existing arrangements with a passion that purely pragmatic politicians could not match. However, even in his early conservative phase, Bismarck displayed a flexibility and willingness to adapt that distinguished him from more rigid ideological thinkers. His conservatism was instrumental rather than dogmatic. He supported traditional institutions because he believed they served Prussia's interests, not because he considered them inherently superior to all possible alternatives. The failure of the Frankfurt Parliament and the rejection of the imperial crown by Frederick William IV created new opportunities for Prussian diplomacy, and Bismarck's talents were soon called upon to serve the kingdom's interests on a broader stage. His appointment as Prussia's representative to the restored German Confederation in 1851 marked the beginning of his emergence as a major figure in German politics. The Frankfurt posting provided Bismarck with invaluable experience in the art of German diplomacy. The Federal Assembly, where representatives from the various German states gathered to discuss matters of common concern, was a school for understanding the complex relationships between the different German governments. Here, Bismarck learned to navigate the intricate web of competing interests that characterized German politics. His most important insight from this period concerned the fundamental incompatibility between Austrian and Prussian interests within the German system. While both powers claimed to represent German interests, Bismarck recognized that their rivalry was ultimately irreconcilable. Austria's leadership of the Confederation depended on maintaining the fragmented structure that had emerged from the Congress of Vienna, while Prussia's growing power and ambitions required a more centralized system that would allow for more effective coordination of German resources. This understanding led Bismarck to abandon the traditional Prussian policy of cooperation with Austria in favor of a more assertive approach that would challenge Habsburg leadership of the German states. His reports to Berlin during this period reveal a systematic analysis of Austrian weaknesses and a growing confidence that Prussia could successfully challenge Austrian dominance if the proper opportunities arose. The diplomatic crisis that erupted during the Crimean War 1853-1856 provided Bismarck with his first opportunity to demonstrate his strategic thinking on a European scale. While most German leaders favored supporting Austria's neutral position, Bismarck argued that Prussia should align itself with Russia, viewing the conflict as an opportunity to isolate Austria and weaken its position within the German system. His advocacy of the Russian alliance reflected his understanding that successful diplomacy required the careful calculation of long-term advantages, rather than simple adherence to traditional friendships. Russia's geographic position and military power, he argued, made it a natural partner for Prussia in any future confrontation with Austria and France. The end of the Crimean War and the subsequent diplomatic realignment of Europe created new possibilities for German politics. The Congress of Paris, 1856, which formally ended the conflict, established a new balance of power that reduced Russian influence while strengthening the position of France and Britain. For the German states, this development meant that the European context within which their rivalries played out had fundamentally changed. Bismarck's analysis of these developments convinced him that Prussia's moment of opportunity was approaching. The weakening of Russia, traditionally Austria's most important ally, combined with the growing ambitions of Napoleon III in France, created a situation in which careful diplomacy might enable Prussia to achieve its goals without facing the united opposition of all the major European powers. His appointment as Prussian ambassador to St. Petersburg in 1859 provided him with additional insights into Russian thinking and confirmed his belief that the Tsarist government could be persuaded to support Prussian ambitions in Germany. The Russian court, still resentful of Austria's failure to support Russia during the Crimean War, proved receptive to Bismarck's arguments about the benefits of a stronger Prussia in Central Europe. The brief posting to Paris that followed his Russian assignment gave Bismarck equally valuable experience in dealing with Napoleon III and the French government. His conversations with the French emperor convinced him that Napoleon's ambitions in Europe could be manipulated to serve Prussian interests, provided that Prussia was prepared to act decisively when the proper moment arrived. By 1862, when King William I recalled Bismarck to Berlin to serve as Minister-President of Prussia, the future Iron Chancellor had developed a comprehensive understanding of European politics and a clear vision of how Prussia could achieve German unification under its leadership. His years of diplomatic experience had taught him that successful statesmanship required not only a clear understanding of one's own interests, but also the ability to anticipate and manipulate the actions of one's opponents. The constitutional crisis that brought Bismarck to power in Prussia revealed both the challenges and opportunities that would define his career. The Prussian parliament's refusal to approve the military budget that King William I considered essential for the kingdom's security created a deadlock that threatened to under monarchy's authority. Liberal politicians, emboldened by their electoral success, demanded greater parliamentary control over government policy in exchange for their approval of increased military spending. Bismarck's solution to this crisis demonstrated the combination of legal sophistication and political boldness that would characterize his approach to governance. Rather than seeking a compromise with the liberal opposition, he argued that the Constitution's failure to provide clear guidance for resolving conflicts between the Crown and Parliament created a gap that could only be filled by the exercise of royal authority. This gap theory enabled the government to collect taxes and maintain military forces without parliamentary approval, effectively nullifying the liberal opposition's ability to influence government policy. The theory was legally questionable and politically dangerous, but it provided the Crown with the freedom of action necessary to pursue its goals without being constrained by parliamentary opposition. The success of this strategy depended entirely on Bismarck's ability to deliver results that would vindicate the government's defiance of Parliament. If his policies failed, the constitutional crisis would likely result in either a complete victory for the liberal opposition or a breakdown of the political system that could lead to revolution. The stakes, in other words, could not have been higher. Bismarck's confidence in his ability to manage these risks reflected his understanding that the liberal opposition's power was ultimately limited by its inability to offer a credible alternative to royal authority. The liberals could obstruct government policy, but they lacked the military force and popular support necessary to overthrow the monarchy. Moreover, their commitment to legal and constitutional methods meant that they were unlikely to resort to revolutionary violence even if their parliamentary tactics failed. The stage was thus set for the most dramatic phase of Bismarck's career, in which he would attempt to resolve the German question through a combination of diplomatic skill and military force. His success would depend on his ability to navigate the complex web of European politics while maintaining unity within Prussia and gradually building support for his policies among the German states. As 1862 drew to a close, the man who would become known as the Iron Chancellor prepared to embark on the series of wars and diplomatic maneuvers that would transform the map of Europe and create the German Empire. His years of preparation, his deep understanding of German and European politics, and his unwavering confidence in Prussia's destiny had brought him to this moment of supreme opportunity. The gentle autumn winds that swept across the plains of Brandenburg carried with them the scent of change, though few contemporaries could have imagined the magnitude of the transformation that was about to begin. In the chancelleries of Europe, in the meeting halls of the German states, and in the minds of ordinary citizens who still remembered the failed hopes of 1848, the future remained uncertain. But in the calculating mind of Otto von Bismarck, the outlines of a new German empire were already taking shape. The chamber felt heavy with unspoken tensions as Bismarck's mind worked through the intricate web of European diplomacy. Each move required the precision of a master chess player, each decision carrying the weight of kingdoms. The Iron Chancellor understood that German unity would not come through speeches and parliamentary debates, but through what he would later call blood and iron, the harsh realities of war and political maneuvering. In the quiet corridors of the Wilhelmstrasse, where Prussia's foreign ministry conducted its affairs, maps covered every available surface. Red pins marked Austrian positions, blue ones tracked Danish movements, and green indicated the delicate balance of smaller German states. Bismarck would stand before these maps in the early morning hours, his fingers tracing potential battle lines, while his mind calculated the diplomatic consequences of each military action. The first test of his grand strategy came with the Schleswig-Holstein question, a dispute so complex that Lord Palmerston once quipped that only 3 people ever understood it: Prince Albert, who was dead, a German professor who had gone mad, and himself, who had forgotten all about it. Yet within this labyrinthine controversy lay Bismarck's opportunity to begin the process of German unification through carefully orchestrated conflict. The duchies of Schleswig and Holstein lay like sleeping giants at the base of the Danish peninsula, their fate intertwined with the very soul of Germanic identity. For generations, these lands had existed in a peculiar constitutional arrangement. Holstein was part of the German Confederation, while Schleswig was not, yet both were ruled by the Danish crown. The arrangement had worked as long as the same bloodline occupied both the Danish throne and the ducal seats. But in 1863, fate intervened with the death of Frederick VII of Denmark. Frederick VII left no direct heir, and the succession laws differed between Denmark and the duchies. While Prince Christian of Glucksburg ascended to the Danish throne as Christian IX, the duchy's succession fell to Frederick of Augustenburg, creating a crisis that would echo through the halls of every European chancellery. The new Danish king, perhaps influenced by the rising tide of Danish nationalism, chose to incorporate Schleswig fully into Denmark through a new constitution, a move that directly challenged the delicate balance that had maintained peace. Bismarck saw in this constitutional crisis the perfect pretext for his first great gambit. But he would not act alone. In a stroke of diplomatic genius, he convinced Austria, Prussia's greatest rival within the German Confederation, to join in a joint intervention against Denmark. To Vienna, the action appeared to be about upholding the rights of German princes and the authority of the German Confederation. To Bismarck, it was the first move in a much larger game. The winter of 1864 brought war to the duchies with the methodical precision of a Prussian military operation. Austrian and Prussian forces crossed the Oder River on February 1, 1864, their breath visible in the cold air as they advanced through the flat, wind-swept landscape. The Danish army, though brave and well-trained, faced overwhelming odds. The fortified Dannevirke, Denmark's ancient defensive line that had protected the kingdom for nearly 1,000 years, was abandoned after fierce artillery bombardment made its position untenable. General Helmuth von Moltke, Prussia's methodical military genius, had planned the campaign with the precision of a clockmaker. His forces moved with telegraph coordination, railroad supply lines, and the latest rifled artillery, innovations that made the Danish War a preview of modern warfare. The Siege of Duppel, the strongest Danish fortress, became a showcase of Prussian military engineering and determination. For weeks, Prussian artillery pounded the Danish fortifications, while engineers dug approach trenches with mathematical precision. The bombardment could be heard for miles across the countryside, a constant thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old order. On April 18, 1864, the final assault began at dawn. Prussian infantry, moving with disciplined coordination, overwhelmed the Danish defenders in a battle that lasted only hours but would be remembered for generations. The Danish defeat was complete, but Bismarck's diplomatic maneuvering had only just begun. The peace negotiations revealed the true complexity of his strategy. Rather than allowing the duchies to fall under the rule of Frederick of Augustenburg, which would have created a new German state outside Prussian influence, Bismarck engineered a solution that placed both duchies under joint Austro-Prussian administration. To the outside world, it appeared as if the two great German powers were cooperating. In reality, Bismarck had created a situation guaranteed to generate future conflict with Austria. The Convention of Gastein, signed in August 1865, formalized this arrangement, with Prussia administering Schleswig and Austria controlling Holstein. Yet this division was inherently unstable. Holstein was completely surrounded by Prussian territory, while Schleswig's administration gave Prussia a stranglehold on Austrian communications with their new province. Bismarck had laid the groundwork for his next, more ambitious gambit. In the quiet aftermath of the Danish War, as diplomats returned to their capitals and soldiers to their barracks, few realized that the first step toward German unification had been taken. The joint Austrian-Prussian administration of the duchies had demonstrated Prussian military efficiency while creating the conditions for future conflict. More importantly, it had shown the smaller German states that Prussia could act decisively, while Austria remained bound by the conventions of the old order. The relationship between Austria and Prussia had always carried the tragic weight of family rivalry. Both were German states, both claimed leadership of the German peoples, yet both understood that only one could ultimately prevail. The Holy Roman Empire had provided a framework for this coexistence for nearly a millennium, but that ancient structure had crumbled under Napoleon's assault. Now in the 1860s, the question of German leadership could no longer be avoided or postponed. Bismarck spent the winter of 1865 to 1866 in careful preparation for the conflict he knew must come. His diplomatic strategy was as methodical as any military campaign. First, he secured French neutrality through carefully ambiguous promises regarding territorial compensation. Napoleon III, still dreaming of French expansion and believing that an Austro-Prussian war would weaken both German powers, agreed to remain neutral in exchange for vague assurances about future French gains. The alliance with Italy proved even more crucial to Bismarck's plans. The Kingdom of Italy, still incomplete with Venice remaining under Austrian control, eagerly embraced the opportunity to complete national unification. The Italian alliance meant that Austria would face a two-front war, a strategic nightmare that would divide Austrian forces and attention. When the treaty was signed in Berlin, Bismarck knew that the balance of power had shifted decisively in Prussia's favor. But perhaps most ingeniously, Bismarck had been working quietly to neutralize Russia, the great Eastern power that had traditionally supported Austria. Through patient diplomacy and by supporting Russian interests in the Black Sea, he ensured that the Tsar would not intervene on Austria's behalf. The diplomatic isolation of Austria was nearly complete, achieved through months of careful negotiation and strategic patience. The immediate pretext for war came from the impossible situation in Holstein. Austrian administrators, surrounded by Prussian territory and dependent on Prussian goodwill for every supply wagon, found their position increasingly untenable. When Austria brought the Schleswig-Holstein question before the German Confederation in Frankfurt, asking for a federal solution, Bismarck declared this a violation of the Gastein Convention and ordered Prussian troops to occupy Holstein. Occupation of Holstein on June 9, 1866, was conducted with the quiet efficiency that had become the hallmark of Prussian military operations. Austrian administrators were given safe passage, their archives carefully preserved, their property respected. Yet the symbolism was unmistakable. Prussia had acted unilaterally, outside the framework of the German Confederation, asserting its own authority over Austrian protests. Austria's response came through the German Confederation, where Habsburg diplomats had spent centuries building alliances and maintaining influence. On June 14, 1866, the German Diet voted to mobilize Confederation forces against Prussia. The vote was close. Only a handful of states supported Austria, while others remained neutral or secretly favored Prussia. But the legal framework of the old Confederation had been preserved, and Austria could claim to be defending legitimate German institutions against Prussian aggression. Bismarck's response was characteristically bold. On June 15, 1866, he declared, "The German Confederation dissolved and announced the formation of a new North German Confederation under Prussian leadership." This was not merely a diplomatic gesture, but a revolutionary act that swept away nearly 5 centuries of Habsburg leadership in German affairs. The die was cast and war became inevitable. The military campaign that followed would be remembered as the 7 Weeks' War, though its decisive phase lasted only days. General Helmuth von Moltke had spent years modernizing the Prussian army, introducing new tactics, improved logistics, and revolutionary communications. The Prussian forces moved with railroad precision, their mobilization so efficient that Austrian commanders found themselves facing enemy forces before their own armies had completed concentration. The Prussian advance into Bohemia proceeded along 3 separate routes, a strategy that initially worried King Wilhelm I, but demonstrated Malta's confidence in his communications and supply systems. The 3 armies would converge on the fortress of Königgrätz, where the fate of German leadership would be decided. The Austrian army, commanded by Ludwig von Benedict, fell back toward this strong position, hoping to use the fortress's guns to offset Prussian advantages in organization and equipment. The Battle of Königgrätz, fought on July 3, 1866, dawned. With morning mist rising from the Elbe River, Austrian forces, approximately 240,000 strong, occupied strong defensive positions around the fortress. The Prussian armies, totaling nearly 280,000 men, approached from 3 directions with the precision of a complex mechanical device. The battle would test not only military tactics but the very soul of German identity. The fighting began at dawn. with the First Army under Prince Friedrich Karl attacking the Austrian right flank. The sound of artillery echoed across the Bohemian countryside as thousands of men advanced through the morning mist. The Austrian defense was stubborn, their infantry fighting with the desperation of men who understood that more than military victory was at stake. This was a battle for the leadership of the German peoples, and Habsburg honor demanded sacrifice. Throughout the morning, the battle remained in doubt. Austrian artillery, well positioned and skillfully handled, extracted a terrible toll from the advancing Prussian columns. The new Prussian needle gun, with its superior rate of fire, began to tell in the infantry exchanges, but Austrian cavalry charges threatened to break the Prussian lines at several points. The fate of the battle hung in the balance as noon approached. The decisive moment came when the Prussian Second Army under Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm arrived on the Austrian left flank. The Crown Prince, a thoughtful and cultured man who had initially opposed the war, led his forces with unexpected tactical brilliance. The Austrian line, already stretched thin by hours of fighting, could not withstand this fresh assault from an unexpected direction. The breakthrough came with the sudden swiftness of an avalanche. Austrian resistance collapsed with tragic suddenness. Whole regiments, which had fought with magnificent courage throughout the morning, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. The Habsburg military tradition, built over centuries of European warfare, crumbled in the face of Prussian military innovation and superior organization. By evening, the Austrian army was in full retreat, leaving behind 44,000 casualties and the shattered remnants of Austrian influence in German affairs. The victory at Königgrätz was so complete that it stunned even Bismarck. In a single day, Prussia had achieved what centuries of Habsburg rule had made seem impossible: the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. The news reached Berlin by telegraph within hours, and celebrations erupted throughout the Prussian capital. But Bismarck, ever the realist, understood that military victory was only the beginning of the political transformation that must follow. The peace negotiations that followed demonstrated Bismarck's political genius as clearly as the war had. SHOWN, Prussian military superiority. Against the wishes of King Wilhelm I and the Prussian military leadership, who favored a harsh peace that would permanently cripple Austria, Bismarck insisted on moderate terms. Austria lost no territory to Prussia, paid only a modest indemnity, and was allowed to retain its dignity and international standing. This magnanimity was not sentiment, but calculation. Bismarck understood that Austria, excluded from German affairs but treated with respect, might become a future ally against France. Or Russia. A humiliated Austria would become a permanent enemy, potentially allying with France against the emerging German state. The Treaty of Prague, signed on August 23, 1866, reflected this strategic wisdom. Austria was excluded from the new North German Confederation, but retained the option of friendship with the new German power. The smaller German states that had sided with Austria faced a different fate. Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, and Frankfurt were annexed directly by Prussia, their ruling dynasties deposed, and their territories incorporated into the expanding Prussian kingdom. These annexations were necessary to create geographical unity for the new North German Confederation, but they also served notice that the old order of German particularism was ending forever. The North German Confederation, established in 1867, represented a constitutional innovation that balanced Prussian dominance with the traditions of German federalism. The Confederation included all German states north of the main river, with Prussia holding the presidency and controlling foreign policy, military affairs, and customs. The other states retained internal autonomy, but accepted Prussian leadership in matters of national importance. The constitutional structure was carefully designed to appear federal while ensuring Prussian control. The Bundesrat, representing the state governments, provided a forum for consultation and debate. The Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage, gave voice to popular opinion. But the Chancellor, appointed by the Prussian king in his capacity as Confederation president, controlled the executive apparatus and could effectively override both bodies through his control of military and foreign policy. The success of the North German Confederation created a new balance of power in Europe that few nations could ignore. France, in particular, watched with growing alarm as Prussian influence extended throughout northern Germany. Napoleon III, the nephew of the great Napoleon, had built his empire on the premise of French leadership in European affairs. The emergence of a unified Germany under Prussian leadership threatened the very foundations of French foreign policy. The southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, remained outside the North German Confederation. But their independence was increasingly theoretical. Secret military agreements with Prussia ensured that, in case of war, their armies would serve under Prussian command. Economically, they were bound to Prussia through the customs union that had been operating since the 1830s. Culturally and linguistically, they were German, sharing the same literature, philosophy, and music as their northern neighbors. Bismarck understood that the final unification of Germany would require a crisis that would force the southern states to choose between French and Prussian leadership. He did not create this crisis, but when it emerged from the complex dynamics of European diplomacy, he was prepared to exploit it with the skill that had made him the most feared statesman in Europe. The crisis began in Spain, where a military revolution in 1868 had driven Queen Isabella II into exile. The Spanish government, seeking a new monarch, offered the throne to Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a distant relative of the Prussian royal family. The offer was initially declined, but through patient negotiation and subtle pressure, Bismarck convinced Leopold to accept the Spanish crown. The prospect of a Hohenzollern on the Spanish throne horrified the French government, which saw itself surrounded by German influence. The French ambassador to Prussia, Count Benedetti, was instructed to demand that King Wilhelm I withdraw Prussian support for Leopold's candidacy. The confrontation took place at the spa town of Bad Ems, where the Prussian king was taking his annual cure. King Wilhelm I, a gentleman of the old school, received the French ambassador with courtesy, but firmly declined to withdraw support for Leopold's candidacy. The meeting was cordial but unproductive, with both sides maintaining their positions. A telegram describing the encounter was sent to Bismarck in Berlin, where the Chancellor saw an opportunity to achieve his final goal, the unification of all German states under Prussian leadership. The Ems dispatch, as Bismarck edited it, transformed a diplomatic disagreement into a national insult. The original telegram had described a polite but firm exchange between the Prussian king and the French ambassador. Bismarck's edited version made it appear that the French ambassador had been rudely dismissed and that French demands had been contemptuously rejected. When published in the German press, the dispatch inflamed public opinion in both countries. The French government, facing domestic pressure and believing that German public opinion would not support a war, declared war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. Napoleon III and his advisors had calculated that the southern German states would remain neutral, that Austria might intervene against Prussia, and that French military superiority would ensure a quick victory. All of these calculations proved disastrously wrong. The southern German states, bound by their secret agreements with Prussia, immediately mobilized their forces under Prussian command. The combined German armies totaled nearly 500,000 men, while France could field only 350,000. More importantly, the German forces were better organized, better equipped, and better led than their French counterparts. The military reforms that had made the Austro-Prussian victory possible were now applied on an even larger scale. The French army, despite its reputation and recent experience in Algeria and Mexico, was unprepared for the scale and intensity of modern warfare. The German invasion of France proceeded with the methodical precision that had become the hallmark of Prussian military operations. Railroad networks, carefully studied and prepared in advance, allowed rapid concentration of forces at critical points. Telegraph communications ensured coordinated action across hundreds of miles of front. The Battle of Sedan, fought on September 1, 1870, marked the collapse of the Second French Empire with dramatic suddenness. Napoleon III himself was captured along with his entire army, ending forever the Napoleonic threat to German unification. The emperor who had rebuilt Paris and intervened in every European crisis found himself a prisoner of the German forces. He had underestimated. The capture of Napoleon III sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The French Second Empire, which had dominated European diplomacy for nearly 2 decades, collapsed overnight. In Paris, the Third Republic was proclaimed, but the new government proved unable to organize effective resistance to the German advance. The Siege of Paris began in September 1870, with German forces surrounding the French capital in a methodical demonstration of military efficiency. The Siege of Paris lasted 130 days, during which the city endured hardships that would be remembered for generations. Food shortages forced Parisians to eat horses, dogs, and even animals from the zoo. The balloons that carried mail out of the besieged city became symbols of French resistance, but they could not change the fundamental military reality. German forces, well supplied and methodically organized, gradually tightened their grip on the starving city. But for Bismarck, the Siege of Paris was not merely a military operation, but the culmination of his diplomatic strategy. As German forces surrounded the French capital, he worked tirelessly to convince the southern German states that only through complete unification could Germany secure its victory and defend itself against future French revenge. The war had demonstrated that German particularism was a luxury that could no longer be afforded. The negotiations for German unification proceeded in parallel with the military campaign against France. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the eccentric monarch who preferred building fairy tale castles to governing, initially resisted Prussian leadership. But the reality of German military success and the promise of internal autonomy gradually overcame his reservations. The other southern German rulers, recognizing the tide of history, agreed to join the new German Empire. The constitutional arrangements for the new German Empire were carefully crafted to balance Prussian dominance with the sensibilities of the other German states. The Prussian king would become German Kaiser, but the title would be offered by the German princes rather than claimed by right of conquest. The federal structure would preserve state autonomy in internal affairs, while ensuring unified leadership. In foreign policy and military matters, the ceremony proclaiming the German Empire took place in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on January 18, 1871. The choice of venue was deeply symbolic, the palace built by Louis XIV to demonstrate French supremacy over Europe would witness the birth of a new German empire. The irony was not lost on the assembled German princes, who understood that they were reversing centuries of French dominance in European affairs. King Wilhelm I of Prussia became Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany in a ceremony that blended military triumph with dynastic tradition. The German princes gathered in the same hall where European diplomats had once sought French favor, now pledged their loyalty to the new German Empire. Bismarck, standing among the assembled dignitaries, had achieved the impossible, the unification of Germany through a combination of military force and diplomatic genius. The proclamation of the German Empire marked the end of the French siege of Paris and the beginning of peace negotiations. The Treaty of Frankfurt, signed on May 10, 1871, confirmed German victory and established the new empire as the dominant power in continental Europe. France paid a massive indemnity and ceded the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, creating the foundation for future conflict, but also providing the German Empire with strategic territory and industrial resources. As the German armies prepared for their triumphal return to Berlin, Bismarck reflected on the achievement of his grand strategy. In less than a decade, he had transformed a loose confederation of German states into a unified empire capable of challenging any European power. The methods had been ruthless, the calculations precise, and the results unprecedented in German history. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, the Iron Chancellor understood that the creation of the German Empire was only the beginning of a new and more complex phase of European history. The balance of power that had maintained peace for decades had been shattered, and the new Germany would face challenges that would test every aspect of Bismarck's political genius. The empire was born, but its survival would require the same careful balance of force and diplomacy that had made its creation possible. The train carrying the German delegation away from Versailles moved through the French countryside with the steady rhythm of victory. Through the windows, the delegates could see the evidence of war, damaged buildings, abandoned equipment, the signs of a nation that had gambled everything and lost. But they also saw the dawn of a new era, when Germany would stand as an equal among the great powers of Europe, united at last after centuries of division and weakness. As the train crossed the Rhine and entered German territory, church bells rang throughout the empire to celebrate the return of the victorious armies. The sound echoed through valleys and across mountains, from the Baltic Sea to the Alps, proclaiming that the German people had found their unity and their place in the world. The dream of poets and philosophers had become reality through the harsh arithmetic of war and the patient genius of statecraft. The German Empire had been born in the crucible of conflict, forged by the will of its people and the vision of its leaders. As the celebration continued through the night, few could imagine that this moment of triumph would also mark the beginning of tensions that would reshape the world. The empire was complete, but its story was far from over. In the halls of the new imperial palace, as diplomats and generals planned for the future, the next chapter of German history was already beginning to unfold. The winter of 1870 descended upon the besieged city of Paris like a shroud of destiny, carrying with it the weight of French defeat and the promise of German triumph. Within the frozen walls of the capital, Emperor Napoleon III's grand ambitions crumbled like autumn leaves beneath the relentless pressure of Prussian artillery. The siege had transformed the City of Light into a fortress of shadows, where the proud sons of France gazed through frost-covered windows at the German campfires that dotted the surrounding hills like fallen stars dot in the quiet chambers of Versailles. Where Louis XIV had once proclaimed the glory of French absolutism, Otto von Bismarck moved through gilded corridors with the measured steps of a man who understood that history was about to turn upon its axis. The irony was not lost upon him that, within the very palace where French kings had humbled foreign ambassadors, a new German empire would soon draw its first breath. The marble floors that had once echoed with the footsteps of courtiers now resonated with the boots of Prussian officers, their voices carrying plans that would reshape the map of Europe. King Wilhelm I of Prussia stood before the tall windows of the palace, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he contemplated the frozen gardens below. At 73 years of age, he had never sought the crown of a united Germany, preferring the familiar boundaries of his Prussian realm. Yet fate, guided by Bismarck's masterful hand, had placed him at the center of a transformation that would echo through the ages. The weight of impending imperial responsibility rested upon his shoulders like a ceremonial cloak, heavy with the expectations of millions who had never known unity. The negotiations for French surrender unfolded with the deliberate pace of a funeral march. Jules Favre, the French foreign minister, arrived at Versailles with the hollow eyes of a man who carried the burden of national defeat. His meetings with Bismarck were exercises in diplomatic choreography, each gesture and word carefully calculated to preserve whatever dignity remained to a fallen empire. The terms were harsh but inevitable. Alsace and Lorraine would pass to German hands, along with an indemnity that would ensure French weakness for generations to come. As January 1871 dawned cold and clear, the stage was set for a moment that would forever alter the balance of European power. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, with its 17 mirror-clad arches reflecting the light of winter sun, had been chosen as the theater for this historic proclamation. The chamber that had once witnessed the diplomatic humiliation of foreign powers would now serve as the birthplace of a new German empire, its gilded magnificence providing a backdrop for Prussian triumph. The morning of January 18, 1871, broke over Versailles with the crystalline clarity that accompanies moments of historical transformation. In the Hall of Mirrors, German princes and military commanders gathered in their finest uniforms, their medals catching the light that streamed through the palace's towering windows. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as if the very stones of Versailles recognized the magnitude of what was about to unfold within their ancient embrace. Crown Prince Friedrich of Prussia stood among the assembled dignitaries, his thoughtful eyes taking in the scene with the perspective of one who understood both the glory and the burden of what this day would bring. As the future Kaiser Friedrich III, he carried within his heart the liberal ideals that his English wife, Victoria, had nurtured, dreams of a constitutional monarchy that would guide Germany toward enlightened governance. Yet he also recognized that this moment belonged to older men with different visions, men who had forged unity through iron and blood rather than through the gentle persuasion of democratic ideals. The Grand Duke of Baden, Wilhelm's nephew, moved through the assembled crowd with the confidence of one who would play a crucial role in the ceremony to come. It was he who would offer the imperial crown to his uncle, speaking the words that would transform a Prussian king into a German Kaiser. The choice of the Grand Duke for this honor was itself a symbol of the broader unity that had emerged from the crucible of war, a gesture that acknowledged the voluntary participation of the southern German states in this new imperial venture. Otto von Bismarck, dressed in the blue uniform of a major general, stood apart from the crowd with the bearing of a man who had orchestrated every detail of this moment. His pale blue eyes surveyed the scene with satisfaction, noting the presence of princes who had once viewed Prussia with suspicion and fear. The architect of German unity had spent decades maneuvering through the complex web of German politics, using war and diplomacy with equal skill to achieve what centuries of previous statesmen had failed to accomplish. As the clock approached noon, a hush fell over the assembly. The moment had arrived for the proclamation that would birth a new European power and forever alter the continent's political landscape. Wilhelm I, reluctant to the end about accepting the imperial title, stepped forward with the dignity of a monarch who understood that personal preferences must yield to historical necessity. His uniform, adorned with the orders of the Black Eagle and the Red Eagle, spoke of Prussian tradition even as he prepared to assume a role that transcended his beloved homeland. The Grand Duke of Baden's voice rang out clear and strong in the gilded chamber. "Long live His Imperial and Royal Majesty Kaiser Wilhelm." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the assembled princes and generals took up the cry, their voices joining an acclamation that echoed through the Hall of Mirrors and beyond, carrying the news of German unity to a continent that would never be the same. In that moment of proclamation, centuries of German fragmentation came to an end. The Holy Roman Empire, dissolved by Napoleon's ambition 65 years earlier, found its spiritual successor in this new German Empire. Yet this was not merely a restoration of medieval grandeur. It was the birth of a modern nation-state that would challenge the established order of European power. The princes who had once jealously guarded their independence now found themselves unified under the black, white, and red banner of Imperial Germany. The ceremony concluded with the singing of Heil dir im Siegerkranz, the Prussian royal anthem, that now served as the voice of German triumph. As the final notes faded away, the newly proclaimed Kaiser Wilhelm I stood before his subjects with tears in his eyes, tears of joy for German unity and tears of sorrow for the Prussia that had been subsumed into something greater. The elderly monarch, who had never sought an imperial crown, now wore it with the dignity of one who accepted destiny's call. The proclamation at Versailles was but the beginning of a complex process that would transform the theoretical unity of the German Empire into practical reality. In the weeks following the ceremony, Kaiser Wilhelm I and his ministers worked to establish the institutions that would govern the new realm. The imperial constitution, largely based on the North German Confederation's framework, provided a federal structure that balanced central authority with the traditional rights of the constituent states. The Reichstag, the empire's parliament, would be elected by universal male suffrage, a surprisingly democratic feature in an age of limited franchise. Yet real power remained concentrated in the hands of the Kaiser and his appointed Chancellor, with the federal princes maintaining significant influence through the Bundesrat, or Federal Council. This delicate balance between democratic representation and traditional authority reflected Bismarck's masterful understanding of the political forces that had shaped German unification. Berlin, the Prussian capital, emerged as the beating heart of the new German Empire. The city's rapid transformation from a regional center to an imperial capital required massive investments in infrastructure and administration. New government. Buildings rose from the earth like monuments to unified German ambition, their neoclassical facades speaking of both historical continuity and imperial grandeur. The Wilhelmstrasse became the nerve center of European diplomacy, where ambassadors from across the continent came to pay homage to the new power that had emerged from the ashes of French defeat. The economic implications of German unification were felt immediately across the continent. The new empire controlled the industrial heartland of the Rhine and the agricultural wealth of Prussia, creating the economic colossus that would soon challenge British manufacturing supremacy. The German Customs Union, which had prepared the way for political unity, now served as the foundation for rapid industrial expansion. Factories multiplied across the landscape like mushrooms after rain, their smokestacks rising toward the sky as symbols of German industrial might. Railway construction accelerated under the new regime, binding the empire together with iron rails that carried goods, people, and ideas across the length and breadth of German territory. The great trunk lines that connected Hamburg to Munich, Berlin to the Rhine, and the Baltic to the Alps created a transportation network that would serve as the circulatory system of the new nation. These railways did more than move cargo, they moved the very soul of German unity, allowing citizens from Bavaria to Prussia to meet and mingle as never before. The cultural implications of unity were equally profound. The German language, which had existed in dozens of regional dialects, began to standardize around the educated High German spoken in the northern cities. Newspapers and journals that had once served local audiences now reached readers across the empire, creating a shared national conversation that transcended traditional provincial boundaries. The university system, already renowned for its scholarship, gained new prestige as the educational foundation of a unified German culture. Yet beneath the surface of triumphant unity, tensions simmered that would shape the empire's future development. The Catholic populations of the newly acquired territories looked with suspicion upon Protestant Prussian leadership, while the industrial workers of the Rhine began to organize in response to the harsh conditions of rapid industrialization. Bismarck, ever the pragmatist, recognized these challenges as the price of unity problems that would require the same careful management that had achieved unification in the first place. The Franco-Prussian War's conclusion in May 1871 marked the formal end of French resistance and the beginning of German Europe. The Treaty of Frankfurt imposed harsh terms upon the defeated French, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, a massive indemnity, and the occupation of eastern France until the debt was paid. These conditions, while ensuring German security, also planted the seeds of future conflict. The provinces that passed to German control brought with them populations that would never fully accept their new citizenship, creating an internal tension that would echo through the empire's history. With German unity achieved, Otto von Bismarck faced the even more complex challenge of governing the empire he had created. The man who had earned the title Iron Chancellor through his ruthless pursuit of unification now found himself responsible for the peaceful development of a nation that encompassed nearly 50 million souls. His transformation from revolutionary architect to conservative statesman would define the empire's character for the next 2 decades. The Kulturkampf, or culture struggle, emerged as Bismarck's first major domestic challenge. The Catholic Church, which commanded the loyalty of nearly 40% of the empire's population, represented what the Chancellor viewed as a threat to German unity. The Vatican's declaration of papal infallibility in 1870 had coincided with German unification, creating a symbolic confrontation between secular and religious authority that would dominate the empire's early years. Bismarck's response was characteristically systematic and thorough. A series of laws removed education from clerical control, subjected the clergy to state supervision, and restricted the Church's ability to communicate with Rome. Catholic bishops who resisted these measures found themselves imprisoned or exiled, while parishes struggled to maintain their spiritual functions under the weight of state interference. The struggle touched every village and town where Catholics lived, creating a domestic conflict that rivaled the external wars of unification in its intensity. The Catholic population did not submit passively to these pressures. The Center Party, formed to defend Catholic interests, became a formidable political force that would outlast Bismarck's own career. Its leaders, men like Ludwig Windthorst, proved as skilled in parliamentary combat as the Chancellor himself, using the democratic features of the imperial constitution to resist authoritarian overreach. The party's success demonstrated that German democracy, however limited, could provide a forum for peaceful opposition to government policy. As the 1870s progressed, Bismarck gradually recognized that the Kulturkampf was creating more problems than it solved. The appointment of Leo XIII as Pope in 1878 provided an opportunity for reconciliation, as the new pontiff proved more willing to negotiate with secular authorities than his predecessor. The gradual scaling back of anti-Catholic legislation marked Bismarck's pragmatic recognition that unity could not be imposed through force alone. It required the consent of the governed, even those who disagreed with official policy. The economic transformation of the German Empire proceeded with breathtaking speed throughout the 1870s. The indemnity extracted from France provided capital for massive infrastructure projects, while the unified customs system eliminated barriers to internal trade. German steel production soared, challenging British dominance in heavy industry, while chemical and electrical industries emerged as new sources of national wealth. The empire's population, freed from the constraints of political fragmentation, began to urbanize at an unprecedented rate. Yet this rapid industrialization brought with it social tensions that would test the empire's stability. The working classes, concentrated in the growing industrial cities, began to organize in response to harsh working conditions and economic inequality. The Social Democratic Party, founded in 1875, emerged as a voice for these concerns, advocating for workers' rights and social reform. Bismarck viewed this development with the same suspicion he had once directed toward Catholic political organization, seeing in socialism a threat to the established order he had worked so hard to create. The anti-socialist laws of 1878 passed in response to 2 assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm I, demonstrated Bismarck's determination to suppress what he viewed as revolutionary agitation. The Social Democratic Party was banned, its newspapers closed, and its leaders imprisoned or exiled. Yet as with the Kulturkampf, repression proved counterproductive. The socialist movement, driven underground, emerged stronger and more unified than before, eventually becoming the largest political party in the empire. Recognizing the limitations of pure repression, Bismarck pioneered a new approach to social policy that would influence governments across the world. The introduction of social insurance for sickness, accidents, and old age represented a revolutionary departure from traditional laissez-faire economics. These programs, designed to win working-class loyalty to the existing system, created the foundation for the modern welfare state. The Iron Chancellor's domestic policies thus combined authoritarian control with progressive social reform, creating a model that would be studied and emulated throughout Europe. The 1880s marked the German Empire's emergence as a true European great power, its influence extending far beyond the borders established by military conquest. The nation that had been born from the ashes of French defeat now stood as a colossus whose economic might and military potential commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The transformation from a collection of quarreling principalities to a unified industrial power had been accomplished in the span of a single generation, leaving observers across the continent struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had been achieved. Kaiser Wilhelm I, now well into his 80s, had grown into his imperial role with the dignity of a monarch who had witnessed the birth of a new age. His long reign had provided the stability necessary for national consolidation, while his Prussian sense of duty ensured that the crown remained above the partisan struggles that characterized parliamentary politics. The elderly Kaiser's public appearances, marked by the simple dignity that had characterized his entire career, served to remind his subjects of the continuity that connected their new empire to the military traditions of Prussia. The imperial court at Berlin had evolved into a center of European diplomacy, where the representatives of foreign powers came to pay homage to German achievement. The palace that had once served the modest needs of Prussian royalty now hosted ceremonies that reflected the grandeur of a truly imperial capital. Yet beneath the surface pageantry, the court remained fundamentally Prussian in character, dominated by military officers and conservative nobles, who viewed their new prominence as a natural extension of traditional Prussian virtues. Life in the German Empire flourished under the influence of national unity and economic prosperity. The universities, already renowned for their scholarship, attracted students from across the world who came to study German philosophy, science, and literature. The great libraries of Berlin, Munich, and Heidelberg became repositories of human knowledge that rivaled those of Paris and London, while German scholars made groundbreaking contributions to fields ranging from physics to historical studies. Emergence of German literature as a truly national phenomenon reflected the spiritual dimensions of unification. Writers like Theodor Fontane captured the essence of Prussian society in transition, while the poetry of Emanuel Geibel and others celebrated the achievement of German unity. The theater, once fragmented into local traditions, began to develop a distinctly German voice that spoke to the shared experiences of the new nation. These cultural achievements served to validate the political success of unification, demonstrating that German unity was more than merely administrative convenience. Architecture in the new empire reflected both imperial ambition and traditional German craftsmanship. The great buildings that rose in Berlin and other major cities combined classical grandeur with distinctly Germanic elements, creating a style that spoke to both international prestige and national identity. The Reichstag building, designed to house the empire's parliament, embodied these contradictions, a democratic institution housed in a structure that proclaimed imperial power to the world. The military traditions that had made unification possible continued to shape the empire's development throughout the 1880s. The Prussian General Staff, now responsible for the defense of the entire empire, refined the strategic doctrines that had proven so successful in the wars of unification. The concept of rapid mobilization, supported by an efficient railway system, became the foundation for German military planning. The annual maneuvers, conducted with scientific precision, demonstrated to potential adversaries the formidable military machine that unity had created. Yet even as the empire celebrated its achievements, thoughtful observers recognized the challenges that lay ahead. The very success of German unification had upset the balance of power that had maintained European peace since the Congress of Vienna. France, humiliated by defeat, nursed dreams of revenge that would influence European diplomacy for generations. Russia, once Prussia's ally, viewed the rise of German power with increasing suspicion. Even Britain, long content to maintain its splendid isolation, began to consider the implications of German industrial and naval growth. Bismarck, now in his 70s, recognized these emerging challenges with the same clarity that had guided his earlier policies. The system of alliances he constructed during the 1880s represented his final masterpiece, a complex web of commitments designed to isolate France while maintaining German security. The dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, the Three Emperors League with Russia, and the Triple Alliance with Italy created a diplomatic framework that placed Germany at the center of European politics. The death of Kaiser Wilhelm on March 9, 1888, marked the end of an era in German history. The monarch who had reluctantly accepted the imperial crown at Versailles passed away at the age of 91, having witnessed the complete transformation of his homeland from a middle-ranking European power to the dominant force on the continent. His funeral became a celebration of German achievement, as representatives from across the world gathered in Berlin to pay their respects to the man who had presided over the birth of modern Germany, the succession of Friedrich III, the liberal crown prince who had long waited for his chance to guide Germany toward constitutional monarchy, promised a new chapter in the empire's development. His English wife, Victoria, had instilled in him a vision of democratic governance that stood in sharp contrast to the authoritarian traditions of Prussian rule. Yet fate intervened with cruel irony. The new Kaiser, already suffering from throat cancer, would reign for only 99 days before his own death transformed the succession once again. The brief reign of Friedrich III, remembered as the 99 Days Kaiser, represented one of history's great might-have-beens. His liberal inclinations, had they been given time to mature into policy, might have set Germany on a path toward parliamentary democracy rather than the authoritarian militarism that would characterize his son's reign. The tragedy of his early death was felt not only by his family, but by all those who had hoped for a more democratic future for the German Empire. The accession of Wilhelm II in June 1888 brought to the throne a young man whose personality and ambitions would ultimately lead the empire toward catastrophe. At 29 years of age, the new Kaiser possessed all the confidence of youth, combined with an imperial vision that far exceeded his grandfather's modest aspirations. His dismissal of Bismarck in 1890 marked the end of the careful diplomatic balance that had maintained German security for 2 decades. The year 1888, known to history as the Year of the Three Kaisers, thus marked a turning point in German history. The stability that had characterized the empire's first 2 decades gave way to an era of imperial ambition that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The careful policies that had created German unity would be abandoned in favor of a more aggressive pursuit of world power that would lead to 2 devastating wars and the ultimate destruction of the empire itself. Yet none of this was apparent to the German people as they celebrated their nation's achievements in the late 1880s. The empire that had emerged from the wars of unification seemed destined for continued greatness, its industrial might and military prowess guaranteeing its place among the world's leading powers. The institutions that Bismarck had created, the federal structure, the social insurance system, the diplomatic alliances appeared to provide a solid foundation for future development. The economic prosperity that had accompanied political unity continued to transform German society throughout the decade. The great industrial cities of the Rhine and Ruhr valleys grew with unprecedented speed, their factories producing goods that competed successfully in markets around the world. The agricultural regions of Prussia and Bavaria experienced their own transformation as improved transportation linked rural producers to urban consumers. The empire's population, approaching 60 million by 1890, enjoyed a standard of living that surpassed that of most European nations. The cultural achievements of the 1880s provided evidence that German unity had released creative energies that had been suppressed by political fragmentation. The great composers of the era, Johannes Brahms, Richard Wagner, and others, created works that spoke to the German soul while appealing to universal human emotions. The philosophers and scientists who emerged from German universities made contributions to human knowledge that enhanced the empire's prestige throughout the civilized world. As the 1880s drew to a close, the German Empire stood at the pinnacle of its achievement. The fragmented principalities that had once been the playthings of foreign powers had been transformed into a unified nation-state that commanded respect and fear throughout Europe. The vision of German unity that had inspired generations of patriots had been realized through the skilled leadership of Otto von Bismarck and the military genius of Helmuth von Moltke. The empire they had created seemed destined to endure for generations, its institutions and traditions providing a model for other nations to emulate. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the bustling cities of the German Empire lay wrapped in temporary silence, the achievement of unity seemed almost miraculous. The same sun that had once risen over dozens of independent principalities now illuminated a single nation, its borders stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Alps, from the Rhine to the Vistula. The transformation that had been accomplished in the span of a single generation represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the annals of human civilization. The men who had made this unity possible, Bismarck with his diplomatic genius, Moltke with his military precision, Wilhelm I with his steadfast dignity, had passed into legend even as they lived. Their names would be remembered not merely as individuals, but as symbols of the German spirit that had overcome centuries of division to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The empire they had built would endure long enough to shape the destiny of Europe and the world. Yet the true legacy of German unification lay not in the achievements of great men, but in the transformation of ordinary people who had been given the gift of national identity. The Bavarian farmer who now thought of himself as German, the Prussian soldier who fought for an empire rather than a kingdom, the Rhineland industrialist who saw his market expanded beyond provincial boundaries. These were the real inheritors of the unity that had been won through blood and iron. The economic miracle that had accompanied political unity would continue to unfold throughout the following decades, transforming Germany from an agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse that challenged the established order of European commerce. The social institutions that had been created to manage this transformation, the universities, the insurance systems, The federal structure would serve as models for other nations, struggling to adapt to the modern world. As the 19th century drew toward its close, the German Empire stood as a testament to the power of unity and the possibilities that could be achieved through skillful leadership and national determination. The vision of a unified Germany that had inspired the revolutionaries of 1848 had been realized through conservative statesmanship and military victory. The empire that had emerged from this process represented not merely a political achievement, but a cultural and spiritual transformation that would influence the course of world history. The great cities of the empire, Berlin with its imperial grandeur, Munich with its cultural richness, Hamburg with its maritime traditions, had become centers of European civilization that attracted visitors from around the world. The universities had become repositories of learning that advanced the frontiers of human knowledge, while the factories and workshops had become engines of prosperity that improved the lives of millions. The military traditions that had made unity possible had been transformed into institutions that would defend the peace and security of the new nation. In the end, the rise of the German Empire represented more than the mere aggregation of territory and population. It embodied the triumph of an idea, the belief that people who shared a common language, culture, and history could overcome the obstacles of geography and politics to create a unified nation. This idea, once realized, would inspire similar movements throughout Europe and beyond, changing the political landscape of the modern world. The story of German unification thus became more than a national epic. It became a chapter in the broader narrative of human progress toward democracy, prosperity, and peace. The empire that had been born in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles would face many challenges in the decades ahead, but its founding represented a moment when the forces of unity triumphed over the forces of division, when the dreams of patriots were transformed into the reality of national achievement. As the last light of the 19th century faded into memory, the German Empire stood as a monument to what could be accomplished when vision, skill, and determination combined to serve a great cause. The men who had created this unity could rest in the knowledge that they had given their people a gift that would endure long after their own names had been forgotten. The gift of belonging to something greater than themselves, something that would connect them to past and future generations in an unbroken chain of national identity. And so the sun set on the story of German unification, casting long shadows across the landscape of Europe that would stretch into the 20th century and beyond. The empire that had been born from the ashes of defeat would face its own trials and tribulations, but the achievement of unity would remain as a testament to the power of human will and the possibility of transforming dreams into reality. In the silence that followed the tumult of war and diplomacy, the German people could finally rest in the knowledge that they had become one nation, indivisible and eternal. The wind that had once carried the smoke of battle across the fields of Königgrätz and Sedan now carried the sound of church bells and factory whistles, the laughter of children and the songs of workers, the hopes and dreams of a people who had found their place in the world. The empire would endure, its institutions would evolve, and its people would continue to build upon the foundation that had been laid by the visionaries of the 19th century. The story of German unification had ended, but the story of the German people had only just begun. In the depths of forests that had witnessed the march of armies, in the shadows of cathedrals that had sheltered the dreams of generations, in the bustling streets of cities that had grown from villages into centers of commerce and culture, the spirit of German unity lived on. It lived in the hearts of those who remembered the old divisions and celebrated the new harmony, in the minds of those who looked to the future with confidence and hope, and in the souls of those who understood that they were part of something greater than themselves, a nation that had been forged in the crucible of history and tempered by the fires of ambition and sacrifice. The story had been told. The empire had been built, and the future lay open like an unwritten book. The German people had achieved their unity, and with it, they had inherited both the promise and the responsibility of greatness. Time would tell whether they would prove worthy of the gift that had been given to them, but for now, in this moment of triumph and achievement, they could rest in the knowledge that they had written one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of human civilization. The bells of the empire tolled midnight, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. In the silence that followed, the German people could finally dream of a future that belonged to them alone, a future built upon the foundation of unity, strengthened by the bonds of shared identity, and illuminated by the light of a common destiny. The rise of the German Empire was complete, and its story would echo through the ages as a testament to the power of vision, will, and the unbreakable bonds that unite a people in pursuit of their highest aspirations. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise of the German Empire. If these timeless stories of unity, ambition, and transformation have moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who appreciate history's greatest tales, and subscribe to Fall Asleep to History for more peaceful journeys through the ages. Let these stories of human achievement accompany you into restful sleep, and may you wake with a deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped our world. Sweet dreams, and until next time, may history's gentle voice guide you to peaceful rest.